This is Audible.
Hachette Digital presents Artists in Crime by Nio Marsh. Read by Benedict Cumberbatch. Alain leant over the deck rail, looking at the wet brown wharf and the upturned faces of the people. In a minute or two now they would slide away, lose significance, and become a vague memory. We called at Suva. He had a sudden desire to run a mental ring round the scene beneath him, to isolate it, and make it clear forever in his mind. The tall Fijian with dyed hair, vivid magenta against the arsenic green of a pile of fresh bananas, the brown face beneath with liquid blue halftones reflected from the water, then the oily dark torso foreshortened, the white loincloth and the sharp legs. The sound, too, the firm slap of bare feet on wet boards, the languid murmur of voices, and the snatches of song drifting from a group of native girls. The smell must not be forgotten. Frangipani, coconut oil, and wood. He widened his circle, taking in more figures. The Indian woman in the shrill pink sari, wet roofs on the wharf, and damp roads wandering aimlessly towards mangrove swamps and darkened hills. It was a pattern of wet brown, acid green, magenta, and indigo. Everything shifted a little, stepped back a pace. The ship had parted from the wharf. Alain shut his eyes and found the whole impression vivid under the closed lids. "And am I hot?" the success of the ship was saying to a group of young men. "Oh, baby, I'll say I've left half a stone back there, that one-eyed little berg. Hot? Phooey!" The young men laughed adoringly. "It's hotter than this in Honolulu," teased one. "Maybe, but it's not so enervating." She saw Alain. "Hello, look who's here. Come right over and join the party. Look at him. Isn't he the cutest thing? That quiet English stuff certainly makes one great big appeal with this baby. And does he flash the keep clear signal? Boys, this, Mr. Alain, is my big flop. I don't mean a thing to him." "Ah, Miss Van Mays. You don't know a coward when you see one." "Hello. We're going through the barrier," said one of the youths. They all turned as the ship passed through the fangs of the reef. Alain slipped away and climbed the companionway to the boat deck. He filled his pipe meditatively, staring back towards Fiji. It was pleasant up there, peaceful. "Damn!" said a female voice. "Damn, damn, damn! Oh, blast!" Startled, Alain looked up. Sitting on the canvas cover of one of the boats was a woman, dabbing at something. She stood up, and he saw that she wore a pair of exceedingly grubby flannel trousers and a short grey overall. In her hand was a long brush. Her face was disfigured by a smudge of green paint, and her short hair stood up in a worried shock. She was very thin and dark. She scrambled to the bows of the boat, and Alain was able to see what she had been at. A small canvas was propped up in the lid of an open paint box. Alain drew in his breath sharply. It was as if his deliberately cultivated memory of the wharf at Suva had been made articulate. The sketch was very simply done, but to Alain it was profoundly satisfying, an expression of an emotion rather than a record of a visual impression. The painter, an unlit cigarette between her lips, stared dispassionately at her work. She rummaged in her trouser pockets, found nothing, and ran her fingers through her hair. "Blast!" she repeated. "Match?" said Alain. She started. "How long have you been there?" she demanded ungraciously. "Only just come. I haven't been spying. May I give you a match?" "Oh, thanks. Chuck out the box, would you?" She lit her cigarette, eyeing him over the top of her long, thin hands, and then turned to look again at her work. "It's exceedingly good, isn't it?" said Alain. She hunched up one shoulder, muttered something, and crawled back to her work. She picked up her palette and began mixing a streak of colour with her knife. "You're not going to do anything more to it?" said Alain involuntarily. She stared at him. "Why not?" "Because it's perfect. You'll hurt it. I say, please forgive me. Frightful impertinence. I do apologize." "Oh, don't be ridiculous," she said impatiently, and screwed up her eyes to peer at the canvas. "I merely thought," began Alain. "I had an idea," said the painter, "that if I worked up here on this hideously uncomfortable perch, I might possibly have the place to myself for a bit." "You shall," said Alain, and bowed to her profile. He tried to remember if he had ever been quite so pointedly snubbed by a total stranger. An apologetic exit seemed to be clearly indicated. He walked to the top of the companionway and then paused. "But if you do anything more, you'll be a criminal. The thing's perfect, even I can see that, and I don't know anything about it, but I do know what I like," quoted the lady savagely. "I was not about to produce that particular bromide," said Alain mildly. For the first time since he had spoken to her, she gave him her full attention. A rather charming grin lifted the corners of her mouth. "All right," she said. "I'm being objectionable. My turn to apologize. I thought at first you were one of the don't put me in it sort of onlookers." "Heaven forbid." "I wasn't going to do too much. It's just that figure in the foreground. There should be a repetition of the bluish-grey there, but I can't remember." "But there was," exclaimed Alain. "The reflection off the water up the inside of the thighs, don't you remember?" "Golly, you're right," she said. "Here, wait a bit." She picked up a thin brush, broke it through the colour, held it poised for a second, and then laid a delicate touch on the canvas. "That?" "Yes!" cried Alain excitedly. "That's done it." All right, all right. I didn't realise you were a painting bloke." "I'm not. It's simply insufferable cheek." She began to pack up her box. "Well, I must say you're very observant for a layman. Good memory." "Not really," said Alain. "It's synthetic." "You mean you've trained your eye?" "I've had to try to do so, certainly. Part of my job. Let me take your box for you." "Oh, thank you. Mind the lid, it's a bit painty. Will you take the sketch?" "Do you want a hand down?" offered Alain. "I can manage, thank you," she said gruffly, and clambered down to the deck. Alain had propped the canvas against the rail and now stood looking at it. She joined him, eyeing it with the disinterested stare of the painter. "Why," murmured Alain suddenly. "Why, you must be Agatha Troy." "That's me." "Good Lord, what a self-sufficient fathead I've been." "Why?" said Agatha Troy. "You're all right. Very useful." "Thank you," said Alain humbly. "I saw your one-man show a year ago in London. I should have guessed at once. Isn't there a sort of relationship between this painting and the In the Stadium?" "Yes." She moved her eyebrows quickly. "That's quite true. The arrangement's much the same, radiating lines in a spotted pattern. Same feeling. Well, I'd better go down and unpack." She slung her box over her shoulder and picked up the sketch. "Can I?" Alain said diffidently. "No, thanks." She stood for a moment staring back towards Fiji. Her hands gripped the shoulder straps of her paint-box. The light breeze whipped back her short, dark hair, revealing the contour of the skull and the delicate bones of the face. The temples were slightly hollow, the cheekbones showed, the dark blue eyes were deep-set under the thin ridge of the brows. The sun caught the olive skin with its smudge of green paint and gave it warmth. There was a kind of spare gallantry about her. She turned quickly before he had time to look away, and their gaze met. Alain was immediately conscious of a clarification of his emotions. As she stood before him, her face slowly reddening under his gaze, she seemed oddly familiar. It was a little as though he had thought of her a great deal but never met her before. Then something clicked in his mind, and he realized that he had stared her out of countenance. The blush had mounted painfully to the roots of her hair, and she turned away. "I'm sorry," said Alain steadily. "I'm afraid I was looking at the green smudge on your cheek." She scrubbed at her face with the cuff of her smock. "I'll go down," she said, and picked up the sketch. He stood aside, but she had to pass close to him, and again he was vividly aware of her, still with the same odd sense of surprised familiarity. She smelt of turpentine and paint, he noticed. "Well, good evening," she said vaguely. Alain laughed a little. "Good evening, madam." Miss Agatha Troy to Miss Catty Bostock, August the 1st. Dear Catty, I'm breaking this journey at Quebec, so you'll get this letter about a fortnight before I get home. I'm glad everything is fixed up for next term. Yes, book Sonia Gluck for model. The little swine's beautiful and knows how to pose as long as she behaves herself. I don't think I told you who is coming next term. Here is the list. 1. Francis Omerin. He's painting in Paris at the moment, but says the lot at Malaquin's has come over all surrealist, and he can't see it and doesn't want to. 2. Valmay Seacliff. That's the girl that did those Dabby Rex Whistlerish posters for the Board of Trade. She says she wants to do some solid work from the model, but I rather fancy she's on the hunt. 3. Basil Pilgrim. If I'm not mistaken, Basil is Valmay's quarry. He's an on, you know, and old Lord Pilgrim is doddering to the grave. He's the Pierre that became a primitive Methodist a few years ago, you remember? I hardly think Valmay Seacliff will please the old gentleman. 4. Wat Hatchett. He's an Australian youth I found working in Suva. Very promising stuff. Simplified form and swinging lines. He's as keen as mustard and was practically living on bananas and cheek when I ran into him. 5. Cedric Malmsley. He's got a job illustrating some deluxe edition of medieval romances and wants to get down to it with a model handy. It ought to work in all right. I hear he's grown a blonde beard that parts in the middle and wears sandals. Cedric, not the beard. 6. Wolf Garcia. I had a letter from Garcia. No money, but a commission to do comedy and tragedy in marble for the new cinema in Westminster. So will I let him stay with me and do the clay model? Let him use this studio, will you, but look out if you've got Sonia there. 7. One Phillida Lee, just left the Slade, rich father. She sent me some of her stuff and a rather gushing little request to work under me because she has always longed, etc., etc. I wrote back asking the earth in fees, and she snapped at it. 8. You, bless you. I've told them all to fix up with you. The great thing is to segregate Garcia. You know what he is, and I won't have that sort of thing. It's too muddly. I'm scratching this off in the writing room on my first night out from Suva. Did a small thing looking down on the wharf before we sailed. Came off rather well. I was interrupted by a man whom I thought was a fool, and who turned out to be intelligent, so I felt the fool. There's an American ex-cinema actress running about this ship half-tight. She looks like one of their magazine covers and behaves like the wrath of God. If anything amusing happens, I'll add to this. Later. We get into Vancouver tomorrow. It's been a peaceful trip since Honolulu, where the ship's bell left us. Before that it was rather hellish. Wouldn't it be just wonderful if I did a portrait of her before we got to Honolulu? Her papa would be tickled to death. I had to pretend I'd got neuritis in my hand, which was a curse, as I rather wanted to do a head of one of the other passengers. A very paintable subject with plenty of good bone. However, I got down to it after Honolulu. The subject is a detective and looks like a grandee. Sounds like it too. Very old world and chivalrous and so on. Damn. That looks like a cheap sneer, and it's not meant to be. I'm rather on the defensive about this sleuth. I was so filthily rude to him, and he took it like a gent and made me feel like a bounder. Very awkward. The head is fairly successful. Well, Catty, old lady, we meet on the 3rd. I'll come straight to Tatler's End. Best love. Yours ever, Troy. Catty Bostock to Agatha Troy, August 14th. Dear Troy, you are a gump to collect these bloodsuckers. Yes, I know Garcia is damn good at sculping, but he's a nasty little animal, and thinks everyone else is born to keep him. And who in the name of Bacchus is this Australian blight? You're paying his fare home, of course. Well, I suppose I can't talk, as you've given me the run of your house for 12 months. It's been a godsend, and I've done my best work here. The servants are all right. They only tolerate me and are thrilled over your return. So am I, actually. Your allusions to a detective are quite incomprehensible, but if he interrupted you in your work, you had every right to bite his head off. Well, so long till the 3rd. Catty. P.S. Garcia's just sent a case of clay and a lot of material. Carried forward, of course, so I suppose I may expect to be honoured with his company any time now. We'll probably get a bill for the clay. Chief Detective Inspector Alleyne to Lady Alleyne, August 15th. My dearest Mamma, your letter found me at Vancouver. Yes, please. I should like to come straight to you. No, darling, I did not lose my heart in the Antipodes. Would you have been delighted to welcome a strapping Fijian lady? I might have got one to regard me with favour at Suva, perhaps, but they smell of coconut oil, which you would not have found particularly delicious. Talking of Suva, which I was not, do you know a place called Tatler's End House, somewhere near Bossicott? Agatha Troy, who painted that picture we both liked so much, lives there. She joined this ship at Suva and did a lovely thing of the wharf. Look here, Mamma, if ever a Virginia Van Mays writes and asks you to receive her, you must be away or suffering from smallpox. She's an American beauty who looks people up in Kelly's and collects scalps. She looked me up, and she seemed inclined to collect ours. Gee, Mr. Alleyne, I never knew your detective force was recruited from your aristocracy. I'm crazy to know if this Sir George Alleyne is your only brother. You see. Well, little mum, don't flirt with the vicar, and be sure to have the red carpet out on the 7th. Your dutiful and devoted son, Roderick. P.S. Miss Troy has done a sketch of your son which he will purchase for your birthday if it's not too expensive. Lady Alleyne to Chief Detective Inspector Alleyne. Dear Roderick, your ingenious little letter reached me on my birthday, and I was delighted to receive it. Thank you, my dear. It will be a great joy to have you for nearly a fortnight greedily to myself. It will be delightful to have a Troy version of you, and I hope it was not too expensive. If it was, perhaps you would let me join you, my dear. I should like to do that, but have no doubt you will ruin yourself and lie to your mother about the price. I shall call on Miss Troy not only because you obviously wish me to do so, but because I have always liked her work and should be pleased to meet her, as your Van Mays would say. Until the 7th, my dearest son, your loving mother. On the 10th of September at 10 o'clock in the morning, Agatha Troy opened the door in the eastward wall of her house and stepped out into the garden. It was a sunny morning with a tang of autumn about it. Somewhere in the garden a fire had been lit, and an aromatic trace of smouldering brushwood threaded the air. Troy set off towards the studio, down on the old tennis court. It was a solid square of decent stone, with top lighting, and a single window facing south on a narrow lane, screened pleasantly with oaks and lilac bushes. Troy pushed open the studio door. From beyond the heavy wooden screen inside the entrance, she heard the voices of her class. I've been too long away, she thought, and marched round the screen. Yes, there it all was, just as she expected. The throne shoved against the left-hand wall, the easels with fresh white canvases, the roaring gas heater, and the class. Malmsley was already at work. The drawings were spread out on a table. He wore, she noticed with displeasure, a sea-green overall. To go with the beard, I suppose, thought Troy. Garcia was in the south window, glooming at the clay sketch of comedy and tragedy. Sonia, the model, wrapped in a white kimono, stood beside him. Catty Bostock, planted squarely in the centre of the room before a large canvas, set her enormous palette. The rest of the class, Omorin, Phillida Lee, Watt Hatchett, and Basil Pilgrim, were grouped round Valmay Seacliff. Troy walked over to Malmsley's table and looked over his shoulder. "What's that?" "That's the thing I was talking about," explained Malmsley. "It's the third tale in the series. The female has been murdered by her lover's wife. She's lying on a wooden bench impaled on a dagger. The wife jammed the dagger through the bench from underneath, and when the lover pressed her down, you see. The knife's hidden by the drape. Seems a little far-fetched, I must say. Surely it would show." "Well, it needn't if the drape is suspended a little," said Troy. "From the back of the bench, for instance. Then, as she falls down, she would carry the drape with her." "Of course," Valmay Seacliff was saying. "I went down rather well in Italy. The Italians go mad when they see a good blonde. They used to murmur when I passed them in the streets, 'Bella' and 'Bellissima.' It was rather fun." "Is that Italian?" asked Catty morosely. "It means beautiful, darling," answered Miss Seacliff. "Oh, hell," said Sonia. "Well," said Troy loudly, "I'll set the pose." She stepped on the throne, which was the usual dais on wheels, and began to arrange a seat for the model. She threw a cerise cushion down, and then she got a long blue length of silk. One end of this she threw across the cushion and pinned. The other she drew round to one side, and then to the floor of the dais. "Now, Sonia," she said, "something like this." Troy knelt and then slid sideways into a twisted, recumbent pose on the floor. The right hip was raised, the left took the weight of the pose. The torso was turned upwards from the waist so that both shoulders touched the boards. Sonia, noticing the twist, grimaced disagreeably and slid out of the white kimono. She was a most beautiful little creature, long-legged, delicately formed and sharp-breasted. Her black hair was drawn tightly back from the suave forehead. The bony structure of her face suggested a Slavonic mask. "You little devil, you've been sunbathing," said Troy. "Look at those patches." "Well, they don't like nudism at Bournemouth," said Sonia. The drape was pressed down by her shoulders and broke into uneven folds about the body. "That's your pose, Malmsley," said Troy. She glanced at her watch. "You can hold that for 40 minutes, Sonia." "It's a terrible pose, Miss Troy," grumbled Sonia, "all twisted like this." "Nonsense," said Troy briskly. The class began to settle itself. It was to Garcia that Troy went after she had set the pose. The others shifted their easels about, skirmishing for positions. She looked at his sketch in clay of comedy and tragedy. He had stood it on a high stool in the south window. It was modelled on a little wooden platform with 4 wheels, a substitute he had made for the usual turntable. "Why did you come and plant yourself here, may I ask?" "Thought you wouldn't mind." His voice was muffled and faintly cockney. "I'll be clearing out in a fortnight. I wanted somewhere to work." "So you said in your extraordinary note. Now attend to me, Garcia." Troy lowered her voice. "While you're here, you've got to behave yourself. I won't have any bogus bohemianism or free love or mere promiscuity at Tatler's End. It shocks the servants and it's messy. All right?" "Okay," said Garcia with a grin. "The pose has altered," said Catty Bostock. "Yeah, that's right," said Wat Hatchett. The others looked coldly at him. His Sydney accent was so broad as to be almost comic. Troy went to Catty's easel and looked from the drawing to the model. Then she went up to the throne and shoved Sonia's right shoulder down. "Keep it on the floor." "Oh, it's a swine of a pose, Miss Troy." Troy sighed. She took a stick of chalk from her overall pocket and ran it round the model wherever she touched the throne. "Now you can get up." Sonia sat up with an ostentatious show of discomfort, reached out her hand for the kimono and shrugged herself into it. Troy pulled the drape-out taut from the cushion to the floor. "It'll have to go down each time with the figure," she told the class. "As it does in the Little Romance," drawled Malmsley. "Yes, it's quite feasible," agreed Valmay Seacliff. "We could try it. There's that Chinese knife in the lumber room. May we get it, Miss Troy?" "If you like," said Troy. Pilgrim, Omarin, Hatchett and Valmay Seacliff began a discussion about the possibility of using the knife in the manner suggested by Malmsley's illustration. Phillida Lee joined in. "Where would the knife enter the body?" asked Seacliff. "Just here," said Pilgrim, putting his hand on her back and keeping it there. "Behind your heart, Valmay." She turned her head and looked at him through half-closed eyes. "Can you feel it beating?" asked Seacliff softly. "If I move my hand here." "Oh, come off it," said the model violently. She walked over to Garcia. "I don't believe you could kill anybody like that, do you, Garcia?" Garcia grunted unintelligibly. He too was staring at Valmay Seacliff. "How would you know where to put the dagger?" demanded Catty Bostock suddenly. She drew a streak of background colour across her canvas. "Can't we try it out?" asked Hatchett. "If you like," said Troy. "Mark the throne before you move it." Basil Pilgrim chalked the position of the throne on the floor, and then he and Omarin tipped it up. By following the chalked-out line on the throne, they could see the spot where the heart would come, and, after a little experiment, found the plot of this spot on the underneath surface of the throne. "Now you see," said Omarin, "the jealous wife would drive the knife through from underneath." "Incidentally taking the edge off," said Basil Pilgrim. You could force it through the crack between the boards, said Garcia suddenly from the window. How? It'd fall out when she was shoved down. No, it wouldn't. I'll get you, said Hatchett eagerly. The dagger's wider at the base. The boards would press on it. You'd have to hammer it through. In the boards of the throne they found a crack that passed through the right spot. Hatchett slid the thin tip of the knife into it and shoved. By tapping the hilt of the dagger with an easel ledge, he forced the widening blade upwards through the crack. Then he let the throne back onto the floor. The blade projected wickedly through the blue chalk cross that marked the plot of Sonia's heart on the throne. Basil Pilgrim took the drape, laid it across the cushion, pulled it in taut folds down to the throne and pinned it there. You see, the point of the knife is lower than the top of the cushion, he said. It doesn't show under the drape. If your story was a modern detective novel, Malmsley, you could do a drawing of the knife as it is now, said Troy. Malmsley smiled and sketched on the edge of his paper. You'll have to get that thing out now, Hatchett, said Troy. It took a lot of working and tugging to do this, but at last the knife was pulled out, the throne put back, and Sonia, with many complaints, took the pose again. Over more on the right shoulder, said Catty Bostock. Troy thrust the shoulder down. The drape fell into folds around the figure. Ow! said Sonia. That is when the dagger goes in, said Malmsley. Don't, you'll make me sick, said Sonia. Right through the ribs, and coming out under the left breast, murmured Malmsley. Shut up! Spitted like a little chicken. Sonia raised her head. I wouldn't be too damn funny, Mr. Malmsley, she said. Where'd you get your ideas from, I wonder? Books or pictures? Malmsley's brush slipped from his fingers to the paper, leaving a trace of paint. He looked fixedly at Sonia, and then began to dab at his drawing with a sponge. Sonia laughed. For God's sake, said Catty Bostock, let's get the pose. Troy set the pose, referring to the canvases. Now get down to it. The Phoenix group show opens on the 16th. I suppose most of us want to go up to London for it? I don't, said Garcia. I'll be pushing off for my holiday about then. What about us? Asked Valmay Seacliff of Basil Pilgrim. What do you think, darling? Us? Said Troy. Darling, what is all this? We may as well tell them, Basil, said Valmay sweetly. Don't faint, anybody. We got engaged last night. Lady Allain knelt back on her gardening mat and looked up at her son. I think we have done enough weeding for today, darling. You bustle off with that barrow load, and then we'll go indoors and have a glass of sherry and a chat. We've earned it. Chief Detective Inspector Allain obediently trundled off down the path, tipped his barrow load on the smudge fire, mopped his brow and went indoors for a bath. Half an hour later he joined his mother in the drawing-room. Come up to the fire, darling. There's the sherry. It's a bottle of the very precious for our last evening. Ma'am, said Allain, you are the perfect woman. No, only the perfect mamma. Roderick, why wouldn't you come to Tatler's End House with me? For the very good reason, little mum, that I should not have been welcomed. How do you know? Miss Troy does not like me. Nonsense! Lady Allain looked at a portrait head that hung over the mantelpiece. That picture gives the lie to your theory. Aesthetic appreciation of a paintable object has nothing to do with personal preferences. Bosh! Don't talk pretentious nonsense about things you don't understand. Allain grinned. I think you are being self-conscious and silly, continued Lady Allain grandly. Did you see much of her in Quebec? Very little, darling. We bowed to each other at mealtimes and had a series of stilted conversations in the lounge. On the last evening she was there, I took her to the play. Was that a success? No. We were very polite to each other. Ha! said Lady Allain. Clibborn, the head parlourmaid, came in. A telephone call from London for Mr. Roderick, milady. From London? Asked Allain. Oh, Lord, Clibborn, why didn't you say I was dead? Excuse me, please, mamma. As he unhooked the receiver, Allain experienced a little prick of foreboding. He was not at all surprised when a familiar voice said, Mr. Allain? Hello, sir. How are you, Rory? Said the Assistant Commissioner. Ready for work? Rather. Well, now, there's a case cropped up a few miles from where you are. Address Tatler's End House. What? A woman's been stabbed. Alain noticed suddenly that the receiver was clammy. You'll get the information from the local super, Blackman, who's there now. The model has been killed, and it looks like murder. I'll send Fox down with the other people and your usual kit. Much obliged. Sorry to drag you back before Monday. That's all right, sir. Splendid. I'll expect your report. Goodbye. It was a cold evening with a hint of frost on the air. Alain drove at breakneck speed towards Tatler's End House. On the way, 3 vivid little pictures appeared, one after another, in his mind. The wharf at Suva, Agatha Troy staring out over the sea while the wind whipped the short hair back from her face. Agatha Troy saying goodbye at night on the edge of the St. Lawrence. The headlights shone on rhododendrons and tree trunks, and then on a closed gate and the figure of a constable. A torch flashed on Alain's face. "Excuse me, sir." "All right, Chief Detective Inspector Alain, from the yard." The man saluted, the gate swung open, and he pulled up before a lighted door. A second constable showed him into a pleasant hall where a large fire burned. A door on Alain's left opened, and a stout man with a scarlet face came out.
"Hello, hello. This is very nice. Haven't seen you for ages."
They shook hands. Blackman had been superintendent at Bossicott for 6 years, and he and Alain were old acquaintances.
"Come in here, will you?"
He led the way into a charming little drawing-room.
"Very peculiar business. Sit down, and I'll give you the story before we look at the body."
Blackman opened up a fat pocketbook, settled his chins, and began.
"This property, Tatler's End House, is owned and occupied by Miss Agatha Troy, R.A., who returned here after a year's absence abroad on September the 3rd. During her absence, the house was occupied by a Miss Cathy Bostock, another painter. Miss Troy arranged by letter to take 8 resident pupils from September to December, and all of these were already staying here in the house when she arrived. There was also a Sonia Gluck, spinster, aged 22, an artist's model, engaged by Miss Bostock for the coming term. On the 16th, 3 days ago, the class disbanded for the weekend in order that members might attend a function in London. The servants were given Friday night off and went to a cinema in Baxtonbridge. One student, Wolf Garcia, no permanent address, remained alone in the studio. Garcia is believed to have left on Saturday the 17th, the day before yesterday. Miss Troy returned on Saturday at midday and found Garcia gone. The others came back on Sunday, yesterday, by car, and by the evening bus. This morning the class reassembled in the studio. At 10:30 the class was ready to begin work. Miss Troy had given instructions that they were to start without her. This is her usual practice. The model lay down to resume the pose, a recumbent position on her back. She lay first of all on her right side. One of the students, Miss Valmay Seacliff, placed her hands on Gluck's shoulders and thrust the left shoulder firmly over and down. This was the usual procedure. Gluck cried out, "Don't," as if she was in pain. But, as she habitually objected to the pose, Miss Seacliff paid no attention, shifted her hands to the model's chest, and pressed down. Gluck made another sound, described by Miss Seacliff as a moan, and seemed to jerk and then relax. Miss Seacliff then said, "Oh, don't be such a fool, Sonia," and was about to rise from her stooping posture when she noticed that Gluck was in an abnormal condition. She called for the others to come. Miss Cathy Bostock, followed by 2 students, Mr. Watt Hatchett and Mr. Francis O'Moran, approached the throne. Miss Bostock states that the eyelids fluttered and the limbs jerked slightly. She attempted to raise Gluck. There was a certain amount of resistance, but after a few seconds the body came up suddenly. Miss Seacliff cried out loudly that there was blood on the blue silk drape. Mr. Ormeron said, "Mon Dieu, the knife." It was then seen that a thin triangular blade protruded vertically through the drape. It appeared to be the blade of some sort of dagger that had been driven through a crack in the dais from underneath. On examining Gluck, a wound was discovered. Miss Bostock attempted to staunch the wound with rag. At this point, Miss Troy arrived and sent Mr. Basil Pilgrim, another student, to ring up the doctor. Dr. Ampthill arrived 10 minutes later and found life was extinct. Miss Troy states that Gluck died a few minutes after Miss Troy arrived at the studio. Gluck made no statement before she died.
Mr. Blackman closed his notebook and laid it on the table.
We've taken statements from all this crowd, except, of course, the man called Garcia. Seems, he said, he'd be leaving for a hiking trip on Saturday morning and is due to turn up in London in about a week's time. He left his luggage to be forwarded, and it had all gone when Miss Troy returned on Saturday about 3 o'clock. I've got in touch with the police stations for 50 miles round and asked them to look out for this Garcia. Here's the description. About 5'9", sallow complexion, dark eyes, very thin, thick dark hair, rather long, usually dressed in old grey flannel trousers and a raincoat. Will you look at the statements before you see anybody?
Alain thought for a moment. I'll see Miss Troy first, he said. What about the doctors?
I said I'd let Amtil know as soon as you came. He's the police surgeon. He heads the list in the directory, so Mr. Pilgrim rang him first.
Very handy. Well, Mr. Blackman, if you wouldn't mind getting hold of him while I see Miss Troy.
Right. She's in the study. I've got the rest of the class penned up in the dining room with the PC on duty. They're a rum lot, no mistake, said Blackman. There's the library door. See you in a minute.
Alain crossed the hall, tapped on the door and walked in. It was a long room with a fireplace at the far end. The only light there was made by the flicker of flames on the book-lined walls. Yes, said a quick voice from the shadows. A slim, dark shape, outlined by a wavering halo of light, rose from a chair by the fire. It's me, said Alain. Roderick Alain. You! There was a movement, and then a shaded lamp came to life, and he saw her clearly. Her face was white under the short black hair. Alain took her hand, held it lightly for a second, and then moved to the fire. "It's kind of you to come," said Troy. "No, it wasn't. I'm here on duty." She stiffened at once. "I'm sorry, that was stupid of me." "If I was not a policeman," Alain said, "I think I should still have come. May we sit down, please?" "Do." They sat in front of the fire. "She was a silly little creature," Troy said. "More like a beautiful animal than a reasonable human. But to see her suddenly like that, everything emptied away. She looked faintly astonished. That was all." "It's so often like that. Astonished, but sort of knowing. Are there any relatives to be informed?" "I haven't the faintest idea. She lived alone, officially." "We'll have to try and find out." "What do you want me to do now?" asked Troy. "I want you to bring this girl to life for me. I know the circumstances surrounding her death, the immediate circumstances, and as soon as my men get here from London, I'll look at the studio. In the meantime, I'd like to know if any possible explanation for this business has occurred to you." "I've no explanation, reasonable or fantastic. But there's one thing you ought to know at once. I told the class they were not to speak of it to the police. I knew they'd all give excited and exaggerated accounts of it, and I thought it better that the first statement should come from me." "I see." "When you move the throne, you will find that a dagger has been driven through the boards from underneath. On the 10th, the first morning when I set this pose, I arranged it to look as if the figure had been murdered in exactly this way. Cedric Malmsley, one of my students, was doing a book illustration of a similar incident." She paused for a moment, looking into the fire. "The position of the figure is chalked on the floor. When the students made their experiment, they found the place where the heart would be, inside the trace on the floor. Hatchet put a pencil through the crack, and they marked the position on the underside of the throne. On Friday, we had the morning class, as usual, from 10 o'clock to 12:30 with that pose. We all lunched at 1. Then we went up to London to the private view of the Phoenix Group show. Valmay Seacliff and Basil Pilgrim, who were engaged to be married, left in his two-seater immediately after lunch. They were going to his people's place. Catty Bostock and I left in my car at about 2:30. Hatchet, Philidor and Ormerin caught the 3 o'clock. Malmsley wanted to do some work, so he stayed behind until 6, went up in the 6:15 bus and joined us later at the show. I believe Philidor and Hatchet had a meal together and went to a show. She took him to her aunt's house in London for the weekend, I fancy. And the model?
Caught the 2:30 bus. I don't know where she went or what she did. She came back with Malmsley, Ormoran, Cathy Bostock, Hatchett and Phila-de-Lis by yesterday evening's bus.
When Friday's class broke up, did you all leave the studio together and come up to the house?
No. Cathy and I came up together before the others.
Would the studio be locked before you went to London?
No.
Troy turned her head and looked squarely at him. Why not? Asked Alain.
Because of Garcia.
He stayed behind, didn't he?
Yes.
Alone?
Yes,
said Troy unhappily.
Quite alone.
There was a tap at the door and Blackman appeared.
The doctor's here, Mr. Alain, and I think the car from London is just arriving.
Right, said Alain. I'll come. Blackman moved away. Alain rose and looked down at Troy in her armchair. Perhaps I may see you again before I go.
I'll be in here or with the others in the dining room. It's a bit grim sitting round there under the eye of the village constable.
I hope it won't be for very long, said Alain. Troy suddenly held out her hand.
I'm glad it's you.
They shook hands. I'll try to be as inoffensive as possible, Alain told her. Goodbye for the moment. When Alain returned to the hall, he found the Scotland Yard officials had arrived. There, beaming at him, solid, large, the epitome of horse sense, was old Fox.
Very nice indeed to have you with us again, sir.
Fox, you old devil, how are you? Behind Fox were Detective Sergeant Bailey and Detective Sergeant Thompson. A gruff chorus began,
Very nice indeed.
A great shaking of hands, and then a small, clean, bald man came forward. Blackman introduced him.
Inspector Alain, this is Dr. Ampthill, our divisional surgeon.
Blackman led the way into the garden. A long pencil of light from a torch picked up a section of flagged path. They tramped along in single file. Presently a rectangle of deeper dark loomed up. Blackman said,
You there, Sligo?
Yes, sir, said a voice close by. There was a jangle of keys, the sound of a door opening.
Wait till I find the light switch, said Blackman. Here we are.
The lights went up. They walked round the wooden screen inside the door and found themselves in the studio. Alain's first impression was of a reek of paint and turpentine, and of a brilliant and localized glare. Troy had installed a high-powered lamp over the throne. The blue drape sprawled across the throne was so brilliant that it hurt the eyes. In the middle was a spike. On the margin of this picture, disappearing abruptly into shadow, was a white mound. Alain walked over to the throne and examined the blade of the knife. It was rather like an oversized packing needle, sharp, three-edged, and greatly tapered towards the point. It was stained a rusty brown. He turned to the sheeted mound that lay half inside the circle of light. Dr. Ampthill drew away the white sheet. Troy had folded Sonia's hand over her naked breast. The eyes were only half closed. The plucked brows were raised as if in astonishment.
Rigor mortis is well established, said the doctor. She's been dead 11 hours now. The knife blade passed between the 4th and 5th ribs and no doubt pierced the heart.
Let's have a look at the wound. Alain slid his long hands under the rigid body and turned it on its side. We had better have a photograph of this. Bailey, you go over the body for prints. While Thompson set up his camera, Alain turned up the working lamps and browsed about the studio. Fox joined him. They moved to Cedric Malmsley's table. This, I think, must be the illustrator, said Alain. Yes, here's the drawing for the story. Here's the portfolio with all the drawings. Very Verlapp and Beardsley. The slap of modern thrown in. Hello. Alain had turned to a delicate watercolour in which 3 medieval figures mowed a charming field against a background of hayricks, pollard willows, and a turreted palace.
That's rum, he muttered. Looks oddly familiar.
No matter. Look here, Brer Fox. I think before we go any farther, I'd better tell you as much as I know about the case. And Alain repeated the gist of Blackman's report and of his conversation with Troy. This, you see, he ended, is the illustration for the story. It was to prove the possibility of murdering someone in this manner that they made the experiment with the dagger 10 days ago. I see, said Fox. Well, somebody's proved it now, all right, haven't they? Yes, agreed Alain. "We finished, sir," said the photographic expert. "Right." Alain went over to the throne and covered the body again. "Carry her over to that couch. She can be taken away now. You'll do the post-mortem tomorrow, I suppose, Dr. Ampthill?" "First thing," said the doctor briskly. "The mortuary car is outside in the lane now. This studio is built into the brick wall that divides the garden from the lane. I thought it would save a lot of trouble and difficulty if we opened that window, backed up the car to it, and lifted the stretcher through." "Over there?" Alain walked over to the window in the south wall. He stooped and inspected the floor. "This is where the modelling fellow, Garcia, did his stuff. Bits of clay all over the place. His work must have stood on a tall stool here, well in the light. Wait a moment." He flashed his pocket torch along the sill. It was scored by several cross-scratches. "Someone else has had your idea, Dr. Ampthill," said Alain. He pulled a pair of gloves from his overcoat pocket, put them on and opened the window. Alain shone his torch on the ground under the windowsill. He could see clearly the print of car tyres. "Look here, if you don't mind, I think we'll take the stretcher out through the door and along the path."
"Sligo, you go along and show the way,"
said Blackman. The constable at the door disappeared, and in a minute or two returned with 2 men and a stretcher. They carried Sonia's body out into the night. "Well, I'll push off," said Dr. Ampthill.
"I'd like to get away too, if you'll let me off, Mr. Alain," said Blackman. "2 of my chaps are down with flu and I'm rushed off my feet. I needn't say we'll do everything we can. Use the station whenever you want to."
"Thank you so much. I'll worry you as little as possible. Good night." The door slammed and the voices died away in the distance. Alain turned to Fox, Bailey, and Thompson. "Ah, the old team." "That's right, sir," said Bailey. "Suits us all right." "Well," said Alain, "it's always suited me. Let's get on with it. You've got your photographs and prints. Now we'll upend the throne." They turned the dais on its side. The light shone through the cracks in the roughly built platform. From the widest of these cracks projected the hilt of the dagger. It's been hammered home at a slight angle so that the blade would be at right angles to the inclined plane of the body. It's an ingenious, dirty, deliberate bit of work, this. "Prints, please, Bailey, and a photograph." While Bailey and Thompson worked, Alain continued his tour of the room. He pulled back the cover of the divan and saw an unmade bed beneath it. Bad mark for Mr. Garcia. Numbers of stretched canvases stood with their faces to the wall. Alain began to inspect them. He thought he recognized a large picture of a trapeze artist in pink tights and spangles as the work of Catty Bostock, and that round, high-cheeked face was the one he had seen dead a few minutes ago. The head and shoulders had been scraped down with a knife. He turned another big canvas round and exclaimed softly. "What's up, sir?" asked Fox.
"Look."
It was a portrait of a girl in a green velvet dress. It was most simply done, painted with a kind of quiet thoughtfulness. But across the head, where the paint was wet, someone had scrubbed a rag and scratched with red paint an idiotic semblance of a face with a moustache. "Law," said Fox. "Is that a modern idea too, sir?" "I hardly think so," murmured Alain. "Good God, Fox, what a perfectly filthy thing to do. It's as if a nasty child has done it in a fit of temper." With a swift movement, Alain turned the canvas to the wall. He lit a cigarette and squatted on his heels. "Any prints, Bailey?" "There's a good many blue smears round the edge, sir, but it's unplaned wood underneath, and we can't do much with it. It looks a bit as if someone had mopped it up with a painty rag." "There's a chunk of paint rag on the floor there. Have a go at it." Alain began to prowl round the back of the throne. "Hello." He pointed to a strip of wood lying in a corner of the studio. Covered with indentations. It's the ledge off an easel. That's what was used for the hammering. Take it next, Bailey. Bailey used his insufflator on the strip of wood. "No," he said after a minute or two, "it's clean." "All right, we'll leave the studio to these two now, Fox. Try to get us a full record of footprints as you can, Bailey. I want photographs of the area around the window and the tyre prints outside. Lock the place up when you've done. Good sleuthing." Fox and Alain returned to the house. "Well, Brer Fox," said Alain on the way, "how goes it with everybody?" "Well, the yard's still in the same old place, sir. Pretty busy lately. What a life. Fox, I think I'll see Miss Valmay Seacliff first. On the face of it, she's a principal witness." He tapped on the dining-room door. A policeman answered it. "All right," said Alain quietly, and walked straight in, followed by Fox and the constable. 8 faces round a long refectory table turned like automatons. "Please forgive me for barging in like this," said Alain to Troy. "It's all right," said Troy. "This is the class. We were talking about Sonia." She looked round the table. "This is Mr. Roderick Alain," she said. "Good evening," said Alain generally. "If you don't mind, I think Inspector Fox and I will join you for a moment. I shall have to ask you all the usual sorts of things, you know, and we may as well get it over." Fox settled himself by the sideboard. Alain sat at the head of the table and placed his notebook before him. "Now, I have got your names here, but I don't know which of you is which. Miss Bostock?" "Here," said Catty Bostock. "Thank you. Mr. Hatchett?" "That's me." "Miss Phillida Lee?" Miss Lee made a plaintive murmuring sound. Malmsley said yes. Pilgrim said here. Valmay Seacliff merely turned her head and smiled. "That's that," said Alain. "Now then, before we begin, I must tell you that in my opinion there's very little doubt that Miss Sonia Gluck has been deliberately done to death. Murdered." They seemed to go very still. "Now, as you all must realize, she was killed by precisely the means which you discussed and worked out among yourselves 10 days ago. The first question I have to put to you is this. Has any one of you discussed the experiment with the dagger outside this class?" "I don't know if it's of any interest," drawled Malmsley, "but Garcia and I talked about it on Friday afternoon." "After the others had gone up to London?" "Oh, yes. I went down to the studio after lunch, did some work there. Garcia was messing about with his stuff. He's usually rather sour when he's working, but on Friday he babbled away." "What about?" "Oh," said Malmsley vaguely, "women, things. He's drearily keen on women, you know. Tediously oversexed." He turned to the others. "Did you know he and Sonia were living together in London?" "I always said they were," said Valmay Seacliff. "Did you pursue this topic?" asked Alain. "Oh, no, we talked about you, Seacliff." "About me?" "Yes, we discussed your engagement and your virtue and so on." "Very charming of you," said Basil Pilgrim angrily. "Oh, we agreed that you were damn lucky and so on." Garcia turned all-knowing and said, "Is this necessary?" demanded Pilgrim. "Not at the moment, I think," said Alain. "How did you come to discuss the experiment with the dagger, Mr. Malmsley?" "Oh, that was when we talked about Sonia. Garcia looked at my drawing and asked me if I'd ever felt like killing my mistress just for the horror of doing it." "And was that all?" inquired Alain, after a rather deadly little pause. "Oh, he did say Sonia wanted him to marry her. Then he began talking about Seacliff, you know." Alain said, "When did you leave the studio on Friday afternoon, Mr. Malmsley?" "At 5. I had to change and catch the 6 o'clock bus." "You left Mr. Garcia still working?" "Yes, he said he wanted to pack up the clay miniature ready to send it up to London the next morning. He got me to help him carry in a case from the junk room." "How would it be managed?" asked Alain. "Surely a clay model is a ticklish thing to transport." "He'd wrap masses of damp cloths around it," explained Troy. "And wouldn't it be very heavy?" "Oh, he'd thought all that out," said Malmsley, yawning horribly. "We put the case in a tall stool in the window with the open end sideways beside the stool he worked on.
The thing was on a platform with wheels. He just had to wheel it into the case. Garcia said the lorry would back into the window from the lane outside. Did he say anything about arranging for the lorry? He asked me if there was a man in the village, said Troy. I told him Burridge would do it. The policeman at the door gave a deprecatory cough. Hello, said Alain, slewing round in his chair. The super asked Burridge's if they'd done it, sir, and they says no. Right, thank you. Now, Mr. Malmsley, did Mr. Garcia tell you where the clay model was to be delivered? No, he just said he got the loan of a disused warehouse in London. He told me he was going on a sketching tramp for a week before he started work, said Valmay Seacliff. To me also he said this. Francis Ormeran leant forward. He told me the name of the man who commissioned the comedy and tragedy, said Troy. It's Charleston, and I think he's secretary to the board of the New Palace Theatre, Westminster. Is that any help? It may be a lot of help. The next point is this. I want to arrive at the order in which you all left the studio on Friday at midday. I believe Miss Troy and Miss Bostock came away together as soon as the model got down. Who came next? I think I did, said Philida-Lee. And I think I ought to tell you about an extraordinary thing that I heard Garcia say to Sonia one day. Thank you so much, Miss Lee. I'll come to that later, if I may. You went straight to the house? Yes, I think so. Yes, I did. Yeah, that's right, said Wat Hatchett loudly. You came straight up here because I was just after you, see? Well, said Alain briskly, that leaves Miss Seacliff, Messrs. Ormeran, Pilgrim, Malmsley and Garcia and the model. Who came next? We all did, except Garcia and Sonia, said Valmay Seacliff. Sonia hadn't dressed. I went into the junk room and washed my brushes under the tap. Ormeran, Malmsley and Basil followed me there. She spoke with a slight hesitation, the merest shadow of a stutter, and with a markedly falling inflection. She had a trick of uttering the last words of a phrase on an indrawn breath. She managed to convey the impression that men followed her inevitably wherever she went. Garcia was in the junk room too, I think, said Ormeran. Oh, yes, agreed Seacliff softly. He came in as soon as you'd gone. He would, you know. Sonia was glaring through the door. Furious, of course. Why was that? Said Alain. Oh, because Garcia was making passes at me in the junk room. Nothing much. He can't help himself. Garcia. I see, said Alain politely. Now, please, did any of you revisit the studio before you went up to London? I did, said Ormeran. At what time? Immediately after lunch. I was very troubled about my work. Everything was difficult. The model... He stopped short. Yes? Never for a second was she still. It was impossible. Impossible. I believe that she did it deliberately. Did you all notice the model's restlessness? Ha! You bet, said Wat Hatchett. She seemed to have got hold of the idea she amounted to something. She gave me a pain in the neck, dinkum, always slinging off about Ozzy. Thank you, Mr. Hatchett, said Alain firmly. The next point I want to raise is this. Have there been any definite quarrels with the model, any scenes between Miss Gluck and somebody else? Everyone seemed disconcerted. After a minute, Catty Bostock said slowly, I suppose you might say there are a good many scenes. You had one with her yourself, Bostock, said Malmsley. Yes, I did. What was that about, Miss Bostock? Wriggling. I was doing a thing for the group show. Opened last Friday. She was to give me separate sittings out of class, you know. She seemed to have the devil in her, fidgeting, going out when I wanted her. I didn't get the thing finished, of course. Was that the trapeze artist picture? Asked Alain. Catty Bostock scowled. I dislike people looking at my things before they're finished. I'm sorry, it is beastly, I know, said Alain, but you see, we've got to do our nosing around. Suppose you have. Well, she laughed shortly. It'll never be finished now. It wouldn't have been finished anyway, though, would it? Asked Philida-Lee. I mean, I heard you tell her you hated the sight of her and she could go to the devil. What do you mean? Demanded Catty Bostock harshly. You were not there when I was working. Happened to come in on Thursday afternoon. Only got inside the door and you were having such a frightful row I beetled off again. You'd no business to hang about and eavesdrop,
said Miss Bostock. Her broad face was dull crimson.
"There's no need to lose your temper with me," squeaked Miss Lee. "I didn't eavesdrop. I simply walked in. You couldn't see me because of the screen inside the door, and anyway, you were in such a seething rage you wouldn't have noticed the angel Gabriel himself." "For heaven's sake, let's try to keep our sense of proportion," said Troy. "The poor little wretch was infuriating. We've all lost our tempers with her again and again." She looked at Alain. "Really, you might say each of us has felt like murdering her at some time or another."
Alain looked at Hatchet. "How long have you been working without a tray on your easel?"
"Eh?"
Hatchet sounded startled.
"Oh, yeah, that's right. I took it off to hammer the dagger into the throne." "What?" screamed Philida-Lee. "Oh, I see."
"On the day of the experiment?" asked Alain.
"That's right."
"And it's been kicking about on the floor ever since?"
"Yeah, I suppose so. Half a tick, though, has it?" "Nah, it hasn't either. I've had a ledge all right. I stuck my dipper on it. Look, I had a ledge on my easel Friday after lunch."
"After lunch?" asked Alain.
"Yeah, I remember now. I ran down some time after lunch to have a look at the thing I've been painting. I met you coming away, Ormeron, didn't I?" "Yes, I only looked at my work and felt sick and came away."
"And was the ledge there this morning?"
"You're right, it wasn't, and it wasn't there Sunday night either."
"Sunday night?" said Alain sharply.
"That's right, after we got back, see? I ran down to the studio about 8:30. She was locked, but the key's left on a nail. I opened her up and had a look-see at my picture."
"Did you look at the throne?"
Yeah, I did. I was wondering if I'd paint a bit of the drape, and I had a look, and it was all straightened out, like it always is before she gets down into the pose. I wondered if I'd try and fix it like as if the model was laying on it. I'd an idea that I might get it right if I lay down myself in the pose, but Miss Troy'd go crook if I did."
"Correct?" asked Alain with a smile at Troy.
"Certainly. It's the rule of the studio. Otherwise the drapes would get bundled about and the chalked positions rubbed off." "Yeah, but listen, Miss Troy, Mr. Alain, listen, I've just remembered something. When I went down to the studio just before we all went to catch the bus on Friday, the drape was all squashed down, just as it had been when the model got up."
"You're sure of that?"
"I'm certain, I'll swear to it."
"Did you notice the drape on your brief visit to the studio after lunch, Mr. Ormeron?"
"Yes," said Ormeron excitedly. "Now you ask, I remember well. It was as Hatchet describes, crumpled and creased by the weight of her body, just as when she arose at midday."
"Here," exclaimed Hatchet.
"See what that means? It means—"
"It is pregnant with signification, I'm sure, Mr. Hatchet," said Alain. He paused, contemplating Cedric Malmsley. "What did you do after the others had gone?" Malmsley lit a cigarette.
"Oh, I wandered down to the studio after lunch."
"Was the drape still flat?"
"Yes."
"Did you touch the drape, Mr. Malmsley?"
"No."
"Who scrawled that appalling defacement on Miss Troy's painting of a girl in green?" There was an uneasy silence, broken at last by Troy.
"You mean my portrait of Miss Seacliff? Sonia did that. I said we have all felt like murdering her. That was my motive, Mr. Alain."
Alain lifted a hand as if in protest, then checked himself. "The model defaced your painting. Why did she do this?"
"Because she was livid with me," said Valmay Seacliff. "You see, it was rather a marvellous painting. Troy was going to exhibit it. Sonia hated that. And besides, Basil wanted to buy it."
"When did she commit this outrage?" asked Alain.
"A week ago," said Troy. "Miss Seacliff gave me the final sitting last Monday morning. The class came down to the studio to see the thing. Sonia came too. She was an extraordinary little animal, extremely jealous. They all talked about the portrait, then Pilgrim asked me if he might buy. Sonia took that as a sort of personal slight on her beauty. She seemed to think I'd painted Miss Seacliff because I was dissatisfied with her own charms as a model. Several people said in front of her they thought the thing of Miss Seacliff was the best portrait I've done."
"It was all worms and gallwood to her," said Ormeron.
"Well," Troy went on, "we came away, and I suppose she stayed behind. When I went down to the studio later on that day, I found... She caught her breath. I found what you saw.
Did you tackle her?
Not at first. I felt sick. You see, once in a painter's lifetime, he or she does something that's extra.
I know.
Something that they look at afterwards and say to themselves, how did the stumbling ninny that's me do this? It happened with the head in Valmay's portrait. So when I saw... I just felt sick.
Bloody little swine, said Miss Bostock.
Oh, well, said Troy. I did tackle her that evening. She admitted she'd done it. She fetched up by having hysterics and offering to pose for nothing for the rest of her life.
Troy smiled crookedly.
The stable door idea, she said.
Oddly enough, murmured Malmsley, Garcia seemed to take it as heavily as anybody, worse, if anything. Do you know he was actually ill, Troy? I found him in the garden, a most distressing sight.
How extraordinary, said Valmay Seacliff vaguely. But of course, it was a portrait of me, wasn't it? I attracted him tremendously, in the physical sense. I suppose that's why he was sick.
Oh, bilge and bosh, said Catty Bostock. Can any of you tell me on what sort of footing the model and Mr. Garcia were during the last week? Asked Alain. Well, I told you she'd been his mistress, said Malmsley. He said that himself during Friday afternoon.
Well, I know there was something going on, said Philida-Lee with a triumphant squeak. I know Sonia wanted him to marry her.
Why, Miss Lee?
Well, I went to the studio one day about a week ago, and there they were having a session. Garcia said, all right, on Friday night then, and Sonia said, yes, if it's possible. Then there was quite a long pause, and she said, I won't stand for any funny business with her, you know. The Seacliff bitch. Sonia suddenly began to cry and say Garcia ought to marry her. He said nothing. She said something about Friday evening again, and she said if he let her down after that, she'd go to try and tell her the whole story. Garcia just sort of grunted it, but honestly it sounded frightful, truly. He said, if you don't shut up and leave me to get on with my work, I'll bloody well stop your mouth for keeps. Do what I tell you. Get out.
Have you discussed this incident with anyone else?
I told Seacliff in confidence. I advised her to regard it as nobody's business but theirs, said Seacliff.
How did this incident terminate? Asked Alain.
Well, I made a bangy sort of noise with the door to show I was there, and they stopped.
Are there any other incidents of any sort that might have some bearing on this tragedy? He asked at large. Nobody answered. Then I shall ask you all to stay in here for a little while longer. I want to see each of you separately, before we close down tonight. Miss Troy, will you allow us to use a separate room as a temporary office? I'm sorry to give you so much trouble.
Certainly, said Troy. I'll show you.
She led the way, and Alain and Fox followed, leaving the local men behind. When the door had shut behind them, Alain said to Fox, Get through to the yard, Fox. We'll have to warn all stations about Garcia. We must find this warehouse, then see the maids. Come along to the drawing room when you've finished, will you?
Right, sir.
Alain moved on to the end of the hall, where Troy waited in a pool of light that came from the library.
In here, Troy said.
Thank you. She was turning away as Alain said, May I keep you for a moment? They returned to the fire.
What now?
Asked Troy. I want you to tell me exactly what you did from the time you left the studio on Friday until the class assembled this morning.
Do you think for a moment, said Troy, that I might have killed this girl?
Not for a moment.
I suppose I shouldn't have asked you that. I'm sorry. Shall I begin with the time I got up to the house?
Yes, please, said Alain.
I came up to the house, washed, changed, and lunched. After lunch, Catty and I sat in here and smoked. Then we drove up to our club in London. It's the United Arts. We got there about 4, had tea, shopped for an hour afterwards, and got back to the club about 6. I bathed, changed, and met Catty in the lounge. We had a cocktail and then dined with the Arthur Jameses. He's president of the Phoenix Group. And from there we all went to the private view. We supped at the Hungaria with the Jameses. I got back to the club somewhere around 2 o'clock. On Saturday, I had my hair done at Catcherley's in Bond Street. Catty and I had another look at the show. I lunched early at the Ritz with John Beluska. Then I picked Catty up at the club and we got back here about 3.
Did you go down to the studio?
Yes, I went there to collect my sketch box. I brought the box in here and spent the afternoon at different tidying jobs. I asked when we got here on Saturday if Garcia had gone, and the maids told me that he hadn't been into breakfast or lunch, so I suppose he had pushed off at daybreak. They had sent his dinner down to the studio the night before. He sleeps in the studio, you know.
Why was that?
It was advisable. You've heard what he's like with women.
I see. On Saturday, did you notice the drape?
Troy leant forward. That's what I've been trying to remember. Give me a moment. Yes. The silk was in position, stretched straight from the cushion and pinned to the floor of the throne.
I needn't tell you the significance of this, said Alain slowly. Did either of you go down to the studio at any time during yesterday, do you know?
I didn't, and Catty had an article to do for the Palette, and was writing in the library all day. I sat in here working out an idea for a decorative panel on odd bits of paper. Seacliff and Pilgrim arrived in his car for tea at 5, and the others came by the 6 o'clock bus.
Did you all spend the evening together?
The class has a sort of common room at the back of the house. They all went in there after dinner. I looked in for a little while.
They were all there?
I think so. Pilgrim and Seacliff wandered out through the French window into the garden. I suppose they wanted to enjoy the amenities of betrothal.
Alain laughed.
What's the matter? Asked Troy.
The amenities of betrothal, quoted Alain.
Well, what's wrong with that?
Such a grand little phrase.
For a moment there was no constraint between them. They looked at each other as if they were old friends. Well, said Troy, they came back looking very smug and complacent and self-conscious, and all the others were rather funny about it, except Sonia, who looked like thunder.
Do you approve of the engagement?
No. I think she's after his title. As a matter of fact, I thought Basil Pilgrim had been worried about something since his engagement. I fancy it was something to do with Sonia. She was always uttering little jeers about engaged couples. I think they made Pilgrim feel uncomfortable.
Do you imagine there has ever been anything between Pilgrim and Sonia Gluck?
I have no idea, said Troy.
There was a tap on the door and Fox came in.
I got through, sir. They'll get busy at once. The men have finished in the studio.
Ask them to wait. I'll see them in a minute.
Have you finished with me? Asked Troy, standing up.
Yes, thank you, Miss Troy, said Alain formally. If you wouldn't mind giving us the names and addresses of the people you met in London, I should be very grateful. You see, we are obliged to check all statements of this sort.
I quite understand, answered Troy.
She gave the names and addresses. Thank you, Miss Troy. Do you mind joining the others until we've finished this business?
Not at all, answered Troy with extreme grandeur. Please use this room as much as you like. Good evening. Good evening.
Good evening, miss, said Fox. Troy made an impressive exit.
Learn anything useful, sir?
She says the drape was in the second position on Saturday afternoon.
Stretched out straight?
Yes.
Well, said Fox, looks as though the knife was fixed up between the time this Mr. Malmsley walked out on Friday afternoon and the time Miss Troy looked in on Saturday. It all points one way, Chief, doesn't it?
It does, Brer Fox, it does.
The Yard's getting straight on to chasing up this Mr. Garcia. Bailey found a couple of photographs of the whole crowd in the studio. Here's one of them.
He produced a half-plate group of Troy and her class. It had been taken in the garden.
That'll be this Garcia, then.
Fox pointed a stubby finger at a figure on the outside of the group, a thin, unshaven face with an untidy lock of dark hair falling across the forehead. The lips were unexpectedly full.
If Malmsley and Miss Troy are telling the truth, he's a murderer. Of course, the motive's not much of an affair as far as we've got. Well, I don't know, Brer Fox. It looks as though the girl was badgering him to marry her. It's possible the post-mortem may offer the usual explanation for that sort of thing. Well, on we go.
We've got to get all these people's timetables from Friday noon till Sunday evening. What about Bailey? I'd better see him first, I suppose. Bailey came in with his usual air of mulish displeasure and reported that they had finished in the studio. They'd gone over everything for prints, had photographed the scratched windowsill, measured and photographed the car's prints and footprints in the lane, and taken casts of them. They had found the key of the studio hanging on a nail outside the door. It was smothered in prints. Under the pillow was an empty whiskey bottle. On the windowsill, one set of prints occurred many times, and seemed to be superimposed on most of the others. He had found traces of clay with these prints, and with those on the bottle. "Those will be Garcia's," said Alain. "He was the one who worked in the window." In the junk room, Bailey had found a mass of jars, brushes, bottles of turpentine and oil, costumes, lengths of material, a spear, an old cutlass, and several shallow dishes that smelt of nitric acid. There was also what Bailey described as a sort of mangle affair with a whale of a heavy chunk of metal and a couple of rollers. "An etching press," said Alain. "There's a couple of stains on the floor," continued Bailey. "Looked like nitric acid stains. New. I can't find any nitric acid anywhere, though." Said Alain, and made a note of it. "There's one other thing," said Bailey. He opened a bag he had brought in with him, and out of it he took a small box which he handed to Alain. Inside was a flattened, greenish-grey pellet. "Clay," said Alain. "Where was it?" "In the folds of that silk stuff that was rigid on the platform." "I see," said Alain softly. "Look here, Fox." They could both see quite clearly that the flattened surface of the pellet was delicately scrolled by minute holes and swirling lines. "A nice print," said Fox. "Well," said Alain, "you've done rather well, Bailey." "Anything more, sir?" "Yes, I'm afraid there is. I want you to find the deceased's room and go over it. Come and get me if anything starting crops up." "Very good, Mr. Alain." "Nitric acid," ruminated Fox when Bailey had gone. "I think it's the acid they used for etching." "Looks as if all we've got to do is to find Garcia, don't it, sir?" "It do, Fox, but don't let's be too sure of ourselves. Go and take a dip in the dining room and see what the fairies will send us in the way of a witness." Fox went off sedately and returned with Catty Bostock. She came in looking very foursquare and sensible. Her short and stocky person was clad in corduroy trousers, a red shirt and a brown jacket. Her straight black hair hung round her ears in a Cromwellian cut, with a determined bang across her wide forehead. Alain pushed forward a chair. "I'm sorry to bother you again, Miss Bostock. We've a good deal of tidying up to do, as you may imagine. First of all, is nitric acid used in the studio for anything?" "Etching," said Catty. "Why?" "Well, we've found stains in the junk room that look like it." "Where's it kept?" "In a bottle on the top shelf. It's marked with a red cross." "We couldn't find it." "It was filled up on Friday, put on the top shelf. Must be there." "I see. Right. Now, I just want to check everybody's movements from lunchtime on Friday. In your case, it will be a simple matter. I believe you spent most of your time in London with Miss Troy." He opened his notebook and put it on the arm of his chair. "Yes," he said. "I see you both went to your club, changed and dined with Sir Arthur and Lady Jane's at Batton Square. From there you went to the private view at the Phoenix Group show and supped at the Hungaria, that right?" "Quite correct." "What time did you get back from the Hungaria?" "I left with the Janeses at about 12:30. They drove me to the club. Troy stayed on with John Belasca and was swept out with the dust whenever they closed." "You met again at breakfast?" "Yes. We separated during the morning and met again at the show. I lunched with some people I ran into there. Then Troy and I met at the club and came home. She lunched with John Belasca." "How did you spend the afternoon?" "Dishing up bills for the palette. I was in here." "Did you at any time go to the studio?" "No." "Was Miss Troy with you on Saturday afternoon?" "She spent time turning out that desk over there and burning old papers. Then she tidied her sketching kit. We dined out with some people at Botticott, the Howarths. Got home about 11. "Thank you. Sunday?" "I was at my article for the palette all day. Troy painted in the morning and came in here in the afternoon. The others were all back for dinner." "Did you hear the model say anything about her own movements during the weekend?" "No, don't think so." "You engaged her for this term. How did you get hold of her?" Through Graham Barnes. He gave me her address. Have you got it? Oh, Lord, somewhere in Battersea, I think. Got it written down somewhere. I'll try and find it for you. Now, about this business with the model and your picture, the trapeze artist subject, I mean. Again, that dull crimson stained the broad face. She was playing up, and I ticked her off. I scraped the head down 4 times, and now the canvas is unworkable. The tooth has gone completely. She deliberately baited me, said Catty. But why? Why? Because I expected to get some return for the excessive wages Troy was giving her. What was she paid? £4 a week and her keep. She spun Troy some tale about doctor's bills, and Troy, as usual, believed the sad story and stumped up. She's anybody's mark for sponging. She's got 2 deadheads here now. Really? Which 2? Garcia, of course, and this Australian wild man, Hatchett. She's hopeless, said Catty with an air of exasperated affection. Would you call this a good photograph of Mr. Garcia? Asked Alain suddenly. He held out the group. Catty took it and glowered at it. Yes, very like him, she said. That thing was taken last year during the summer classes. He was here as Miss Troy's guest then, I suppose. Oh, Lord, yes. Garcia never pays for anything. He's got no sort of decency where money's concerned. No conscience at all. No aesthetic conscience? No, his work's the only thing he is honest about, and he's passionately sincere there. If Sonia interfered with his work and put him off his stride, he'd get rid of her that way. She may have refused to give him any more money. Did she give him money? I think so. Ormoin says she was keeping him last year. You think the model was really attached to him? I don't know, Catty said. I've got an idea that she'd switched over to Basil Pilgrim. Have you finished with me, Mr. Alain? Yes, I think I have. We shall have a statement in longhand for you to look at and sign, if you will, later on. Will you show Miss Bostock out, please, Fox? Thank you, I know my way about this house, said Catty with a prickly laugh. She stumped off to the door. Fox closed it gently behind her. Rather a tricky sort of lady, that, he said. There was a rap on the door, and one of the local men looked in. Excuse me, sir, but there's a gentleman out here says he wants to see you very particular, said you'd be very glad indeed to see him, sir. He never gave a name. I rather fancy, Fox, said Alain, that an old and persistent friend of ours has got in first on the news. Unerring as ever, Mr. Alain, said a voice from the hall, and Nigel Bathgate walked into the room. Where the devil did you spring from? Asked Alain. Nigel advanced with a shameless grin. Where did I come from, Specky dear? The blue sky opened, and I am here. Hello, Fox. Good evening, Mr. Bathgate, said Fox. I suppose you've talked to my mamma on the telephone, said Alain as they shook hands. Yes, Lady Alain rang me up to say you'd been sooled onto the trail before your time. She thought the odds were you'd forget to let us know you couldn't come and stay with us. So you instantly motored 20 miles in not much more than as many minutes in order to tell me how sorry you were? That's it, said Nigel cheerfully. Angela sends her fondest love. She'd have come too, only she's not feeling quite up to long drives just now. He sat down in one of the largest chairs. Don't let me interrupt. You can give me the story later on. I've got enough to go on with from the local cop. I'll ring up the office presently and give them the headlines. Your mother, divine woman that she is, has asked me to stay. I've a damned good mind to have you chucked out. Don't do that. I'll take everything down in shorthand, and nobody will see me if I turn the chair round. All right. It's quite irregular, but you occasionally have your uses. Go into the corner there. Nigel hurried into a shadowy corner, turned a high armchair with its back to the room, and dived into it. I am invisible, he said, and I shall overhear their conference. The bard. I'll deal with you later, said Alain grimly. Tell them to send another of these people along, Fox. When Fox had gone, Nigel said hoarsely, Angela started a baby. So I gathered, and so no doubt Fox also gathered. I'm so thrilled I could yell it in the teeth of the whole police force. Alain smiled to himself. We want you to be a godfather. Will you, Alain? I should be charmed. Now shut up. Fox came in with Phillida Lee. She wore a dull red dress covered in a hand-painted design. It was, he realized, deliberately unfashionable and very deliberately interesting. Her face, if left to itself, would have been round and eager, but the austerities of the Slade school had superimposed upon it a careful expression of detachment. Well, Miss Lee, Alain began in his best official manner. "I just want to have an idea of your movements during the weekend. You left Tatler's End House on Friday afternoon by the 3 o'clock bus with Mr. Ormerin and Mr. Watt Hatchett?" "Yes," agreed Miss Lee, looking self-conscious and maidenly. She had stayed with an aunt in the Fulham Road, and had spent most of her time in this aunt's company. She'd also seen a great deal of Watt Hatchett, and had gone to a picture with him on Saturday night. "Now then, Miss Lee, about the scrap of conversation you overheard, did you get the impression that Sonia and Garcia planned to meet on Friday night?" "It sounded like that. Sonia said, if it's possible. I think she meant to come back and bed down with Garcia for the night while no one was here." "What did they do when you appeared?" "Garcia just stared at me. I said, 'Hello, you two, what are you up to? Having a woo or something?' And he said, 'No, just a little chat.' He turned away and began working at his thing. Sonia just walked out. She looked ghastly. Mr. Alain, honestly, absolutely bleached. Oh, Mr. Alain, I do believe he did it. I do, actually." "Were you on good terms with this model?" "Well, I'm not one to look down my nose at a girl because she's a model. I'm a communist, anyway." Sonia was furious about Seacliff. She called her awful names, all beginning with B, you know. She said somebody ought to tell Pilgrim what Seacliff really was like. But I don't believe it was true about Pilgrim. I don't think he was ever attracted to Sonia. I think she just made it up. "Made what up, Miss Lee? Did she suggest there had been anything like a romance between herself and Mr. Pilgrim?" "Well, she said, it was only once, ages ago, after a party. She said she could tell Seacliff a thing or two about him, and if he didn't look out, she would." "I see. You returned in the bus yesterday evening with the model, didn't you? Did you notice anything out of the way about her?" "No. She was doing a bit of a woo with Ormerin. Of course, she wasn't very well. I'm sure that's why she did that terrible thing to Troy's portrait of Seacliff. She was ill, only she asked me not to say anything about it because she said it didn't do a model any good for her to get a reputation for not being able to stand up to the work. I wouldn't have known except that I found her one morning looking absolutely green, and I asked her if anything was the matter. She said the pose made her feel sick. It was the twist that did it, she said. She was honestly sick, and she felt sort of giddy." Alain looked at Miss Lee's rather pretty, rather commonplace face and realized that her sophistication was more synthetic than even he had supposed. "Well, Miss Lee, I think that's all we need to worry about for the moment. When you go back to the dining room, will you ask Mr. Hatchett to come and see me?" "Yes, I will." She got up and gazed at Alain. He saw a sort of corpse-eyed expression come into her face. "Oh, Mr. Alain," she said. "Isn't it all awful?" "Quite frightful," responded Alain cheerfully. "Good evening, Miss Lee." She walked away with an air of bereavement and shut the door softly behind her. "Oi," said Nigel from the armchair. "I'm moving over to the fire till the next one comes along. It's cold in this corner." "All right." Fox, who had remained silently at the writing desk throughout the interview with Miss Lee, joined Alain and Nigel at the fire. "Of course the girl was going to have a child," said Nigel complacently. "Doesn't follow as the night the day," murmured Alain. "She may have been liverish or run down. Nevertheless, it's odd that the little thought never entered Miss Lee's head. You go back to your corner, Bathgate. Here's Mr. Watt Hatchett." Watt Hatchett came in with his hands thrust into his trouser pockets. He was short, with the general appearance of a bad man in a South American movie. His hair resembled a patent leather cap. His skin was swarthy. He walked with a sort of hard-boiled slouch. "Want me, Inspector?" he inquired. "Sit down, Mr. Hatchett," said Alain. "I shan't keep you long. I'm sure you realize the importance of the information we have from you as regards the drape. You will therefore not think it extraordinary if I ask you to repeat the gist of this information." Hatchett went over the whole story again. He remembered now that it was 2:30 by the hall clock when he went down to the studio on Friday afternoon and noticed the drape lying crumpled on the throne. "And yesterday evening it was stretched out tight." Alain asked Hatchett to account for his own movements during the weekend and gleaned enough material to enable him to verify the youth's account of himself. "To return to Garcia," he said at last, "I want you to tell me if you ever heard Garcia say anything about this warehouse he intends to use as a studio in London." "I never had much to do with that bloke.
If you talk to him half the time, he never seems to listen. He did let out that it belonged to a bloke that's gone abroad somewhere. I heard him tell the girl Sonia that much. I see. Since you joined Miss Troy's classes, have you become especially friendly with any one of the other students? Well, little girl Lee's all right. She treats you as if you were human. What about the men? Malmsley's nothing but a big sissy. French bloke doesn't seem to know he's born, and Garcia's queer. What about Mr. Pilgrim? Oh, he's all right. Him and me's cobbers. Was he on good terms with the model? Oh, I don't know anything about that, he muttered. I got nothing in for Pilgrim. I got no call to talk to Dix about my cobbers. You prefer to surround them with a dubious atmosphere of uncertainty and leave us to draw our own conclusions? By cripey, cried Hatchett. It's nothing at all. It's only that the girl Sonia was going to have a kid and Pilgrim's the father. In the silence that followed, Fox was heard to cough discreetly. How do you know this, Mr. Hatchett? Asked Alleyn. Seen it in writing. It's like this. Me and Basil Pilgrim's got the same kind of paint smock, see? I hung mine up with the others in the junk room last Tuesday. On Wednesday morning I put it on. I felt a bit of paper in one of my pockets. It was a note scrawled on the back of a bill. It said, as near as I remember, "Congrats on the engagement, but what if I tell her she's going to have a stepchild? I'll be in the studio tonight at 10. Advise you to come." It was signed S. What did you do with it? Oh, I didn't feel so good about reading it. I went into the junk room and shoved the blooming paper into his pocket. That evening I could see he was feeling pretty crook himself. I guessed he read it. I see. Look, Mr. Alleyn, you won't. I won't clap the handcuffs on Mr. Pilgrim just yet. Now off you go. Good eye, Mr. Allen. Hatchett walked to the door and then swung round. Thanks a lot, he said. Ta-ta for now. The door banged and he was gone. Alleyn leant back in his chair.
What do you make of this business of the note, Fox? Hard to say, said Fox. Looks like the beginnings of blackmail. Very like. Very like. From all accounts, it wouldn't be surprising if we found Garcia had set her onto it, would it now? Speculative but attractive. And then murdered her when he collared the money, said Nigel. You're a fanciful fellow, Bathgate, said Alleyn mildly. Well, isn't it possible? Quite possible on what we've got. Shall I get Mr. Pilgrim, sir? I think so, Fox. We'll see if he conforms to the Garcia theme or not. Fox returned with Basil Pilgrim. He was tan, with a small head, square shoulders, and a narrow waist. His face was rather fine drawn. Alleyn began at once to establish his movements after he drove away with Valmy Seacliff from Tatler's End House on Friday afternoon. Pilgrim said that they motored to some friends of Valmy Seacliff's who lived at Boxover, 12 miles away. They dined with these friends, a Captain and Mrs. Pascoe, spent the evening playing bridge, and stayed the night there. The next day they motored to Ankerton Manor, the Oxfordshire seat of Lord Pilgrim, where Basil introduced his fiancée to his father. They spent Saturday night at Ankerton and returned to Tatler's End House on Sunday afternoon. At what time did you break up your bridge party on Friday night? Asked Alleyn. Fairly early, I think, sir. About 11ish. Valmy had got a snort of a headache and could hardly see the cards. I gave her some aspirin. She took 3 tablets and turned in. Did the aspirin do the job? Oh, rather. She said she slept like the dead. Right. Now, about this unfortunate girl. Can you let any light in on the subject? Fred, I can't. It's a damn bad show. I feel rotten about it. Had you any personal reason for feeling rotten about it? Had Sonia Gluck a closer link with you than with the rest of the class? Pilgrim stared straight in front of him, his lips parted. I see I shall have to make a clean breast of it, he said at last. I think you would be wise to do so. It's got nothing to do with this business, he said. Happened 3 months ago at a studio party in Bloomsbury. Sonia asked me to drive her home. It was the only time. What about the child? Asked Alleyn. God, then she did tell somebody. I don't believe it's true. Everybody knows she's been Garcia's mistress for months. She was poisonously jealous of Valmy, and after our engagement was announced, she threatened this as a hit at Valmy.
How was the matter first broached?
She left a note in the pocket of my painting coat. I burnt it. She said she wanted me to meet her somewhere.
Did you do this?
Yes, in the studio one evening. She said she was going to have a baby. She said I was the father. I said I knew she was lying. I said I'd tell Valmy the whole story myself. And I said I'd go to Garcia and tell him. And I just walked away.
Did she threaten to tell your father?
She said all sorts of things. She was hysterical.
Did you give her any money? Pilgrim moved his head restlessly.
As a matter of fact, I did give her a cheque for 100, and she promised she'd make no more scenes. In the end, she practically admitted the child was not mine, but as she pointed out, she had a perfectly good story to tell my father or Valmy if she felt inclined to do so.
Have you made a clean breast of this to Miss Seacliff?
No, I couldn't. It seemed so foul to go to her with a squalid little story when we were just engaged.
I see. Thank you. I won't keep you any longer, Mr. Pilgrim.
Very well, sir. Thank you.
Fox showed Pilgrim out and returned to the fire. He looked dubious. Nigel reappeared and sat on the wide fender. Let us see Miss Valmy Seacliff, Brer Fox.
I wish you wouldn't make me coil up in that chair, complained Nigel when Fox had gone. It's right in the draught. Can't I just be here, openly? I'd like to have a look at this lovely.
Very well, I suppose you'll do no harm.
The concealment was your own suggestion, if you remember. You may sit at the desk and make an attempt to look like the yard. The door was thrown open, and in came Valmy Seacliff, followed by Fox. She was dressed in a silk-trousered garment. Her hair was swept off her forehead into a knot on the nape of her neck. Moving her hips voluptuously, she walked rather like a mannequin. When she reached the chair Alain had pushed forward, she turned, paused, and then sank into it with the glorious certainty of a well-trained showgirl.
Well, Mr. Alain.
Miss Seacliff? My chief concern at the moment is to get a clear account of everybody's movements during the weekend. Mr. Pilgrim has told us of your motor trip with him to Boxover. How did you spend the evening?
We played bridge for a bit. I had a frightful headache and went to bed early. I felt quite sick with it.
That was bad luck.
The Pascoes had champagne at dinner to celebrate my engagement, and there was brandy afterwards. I loathe brandy. So Basil made me have a glass of port. I told him it would upset me, but he went on and on. The coffee was filthy too, bitter and beastly.
When did you give up the bridge?
I've no idea, I'm afraid. I simply couldn't go on. Basil got me 3 aspirins, and I went to bed.
Did you sleep?
Like the dead. I didn't wake till they brought me my tea at 9 o'clock.
And on Saturday you went on to Ankerton Manor. When did you start?
We had a glass of sherry at about 10, then pushed off. Basil was in a great state lest we should be late for lunch. The poor lamb wanted me to make a good impression on his extraordinary old father. I told him he needn't worry. Old men always go quite crazy about me.
You left Ankerton yesterday after luncheon, I suppose?
Yes. Basil was rather keen to stay on till Monday, but I'd had enough. The old person made me hack round the ancestral acres on a beastly little animal that nearly pulled my arms out. I saw you looking at my hand.
With a slow and beautiful movement she extended her left arm, opened her hand, and held it close to Alain's face. At the base of the little finger were 2 or 3 scarlet marks.
My hands are terribly soft, of course,
said Miss Seacliff. Yes, said Alain. You are evidently not an experienced horsewoman.
What makes you say that?
Well, these marks have not been made by a rein. I should say, Miss Seacliff, that your pony's mane had been called into service. She pulled her hand away and turned rather pink.
I don't pretend to be a horsey woman, thank God. I simply loathe the brutes. I must say I got very bored with the old person, and besides, I didn't want to miss the pose this morning. I've got a good deal to do to my thing of Sonia. I suppose I'll never get it done now.
Fox coughed, and Nigel glanced up at Valmy Seacliff in astonishment. I suppose not, agreed Alain. Now, Miss Seacliff, we come to this morning's tragedy. Will you describe to us exactly what happened, please?
You mean when Sonia was killed? It was rather ghastly. I felt wretched after it was all over. Ill. I do think it was rather cruel that I should be the one to do it, to set the pose. They all knew I always pushed her shoulders down. Well, we all put up our easels and set our palettes, and so on. Sonia went to the junk room and undressed. She came out in her white kimono and hung about trying to get the men to talk to her. Catty told her to go on to the throne. She got down to the chalk mark. She grumbled, as usual, about the pose, and then she lay down on her side. When we set the pose, it was always left to me to push her down into the right position. She could have done it all herself, but she always made such a scene. I'd got into the way of taking her shoulders and pressing them over. She wouldn't do it otherwise.
Falmé Seacliff raised her hands and pressed them against her face.
She didn't struggle, but I felt her body leap under my hands and then shudder. She opened her eyes very wide and wrinkled her forehead as if she was astonished. I thought how silly she looked. I think I said, "Sonia's ill." Then the others came up. Catty put her arms behind Sonia to raise her. She said, "I can't move her. She seemed stuck." Then she pulled.
Her voice died away. Her hands were trembling.
"I didn't know I was so upset," she said. "A doctor once told me my nerves were as sensitive as the strings of a violin."
"It was a horrible experience for all of you," said Alain. "Tell me, Miss Seacliff, were you worrying about your actual hand in the business?"
"What do you mean?"
"I mean," Alain's voice was grave, "the circumstance of it being your hands, Miss Seacliff, that thrust her down upon the knife. Tell me, please, did you notice any resistance at first? I should have thought that there might even have been a slight sound as the point entered."
"I don't think—"
"We are considering the actual death throes of a murdered individual," said Alain mildly. "I should like a clear picture." A look of extreme horror came into her face. She looked wildly round the room, darted a furious glance at Alain, and said in a strangled voice, "Let me out! I've got to go out!" Fox rose in consternation, but she pushed him away and ran blindly to the door.
"Never mind, Fox," said Alain. The door banged.
"She's bolted," exclaimed Nigel.
"Only as far as the cloakroom," said Alain. "The fatal woman is going to be very sick."
"Well, really, Alain," said Nigel, "I consider you were hard on that girl."
"I was sick of that nonsense, she and her catgut nerves. She's as hard as nails. She's not in the least sorry for that unfortunate little animal who died under her hands. Fox, did you get anything at all from the maids about Friday night?" "Not a great deal, sir, and that's a fact. There's 3 servants living in the house, a Mr. and Mrs. Hipkin, who do butler and cook, and a young girl called Sadie Welsh, who's housemaid. They all went to a cinema in Baxtonbridge on Friday night. There's another girl, Ethel Jones, who comes in as a daily from Bossicott. She leaves at 5 o'clock in the afternoon. I'll get to her tomorrow, but it doesn't look promising. The Hipkins seem a very decent couple, devoted to Miss Troy. They've not got much to say in favour of this crowd. Hipkins said he always thought Garcia bats in the belfry, and Sadie said he once tried to assault her and she gave him a smack on the chops. She's rather a lively girl, Sadie is." "What about Garcia's evening meal on Friday?" "Well, Sadie took it on a tray to the studio at 7:30. She tapped on the outside of the door and Mr. Garcia called out to her to leave the tray there. When she came to the studio on Saturday morning, the tray was still there untouched. She looked into the studio, but didn't do anything in the way of housework. She's not allowed to touch anything on the throne, and didn't notice the drape." "Garcia wasn't there on Saturday morning?" "No. Sadie said he'd gone and all his stuff as far as she could make out. She said the room smelt funny, so she opened the window. She noticed a queer smell there on Friday night, too. I wonder if it was the acid Bailey found the marks of, but she said no, she smelt the acid before and it wasn't the same. Look here, Fox, I think I'd like a word with your Sadie. Be a good fellow and see if she's still up." Fox went off and was away some minutes. He came in shepherding an extraordinary little apparition in curling pins and red flannel. "Miss Sadie Welsh,"
explained Fox. Was a bit uncomfortable about coming down, Mr. Alain. She'd gone to bed. I'm sorry to bring you out, said Alain pleasantly. We shan't keep you here very long. Come over to the fire, won't you? He threw a couple of logs on the fire and persuaded Miss Welsh to perch on a chair. She was a girl of perhaps 22, with large brown eyes, a button nose, and a mouth that looked as though she constantly said, "Ooh." "You're Miss Troy's housemaid, aren't you?" said Alain.
"Yes, sir."
"Been with her long?"
"Oh, yes, sir. I was an under-housemaid here when the old gentleman was alive. I was 16 then, sir. Mr. Hipkin, he's training me now for parlour-maid. He says I'll be called Welsh then, because Sadie isn't a name for a parlour-maid."
"Splendid. You like your job?"
"Well, sir," said Sadie primly, "I like Miss Troy very much, sir."
"Not so sure about the rest of the party?"
"No, I am not, sir, and that's a fact. I was telling Mr. Fox, sir. Queer. Well, I mean to say, that Mr. Garcia, sir, didn't fancy taking his dinner down on Friday. He seemed that anxious I wouldn't go in, and with the queer perfume and one thing and another, well."
"You noticed an odd smell?"
"Yes, I did that, sir."
"Ever smelt anything like it before?"
"Oh, well, sir, I said to myself, well, if it isn't what Mr. Marsley's room smells like of a morning sometimes."
"Mr. Marmsley?"
"Yes, sir, it's a kind of bitterish sort of smell, only sort of thick and sour."
"Not like whiskey, for instance?"
"Oh, no, sir. I didn't notice the perfume of whiskey till I went down next morning."
"But you'd never noticed the other smell before?" asked Alain.
"Not in the studio, sir, only in Mr. Marsley's room."
"And on Saturday morning Mr. Garcia's clay model and all his things were gone?"
"That queer-looking mud thing like plasticine? Oh, yes, sir, it was gone on Saturday."
"Right, I think that's all."
"May I go, sir?"
"Yes, off you go. Good night, Welsh," said Alain, smiling. "Thank you."
"Good night, sir."
Fox, with a fatherly smile, shepherded Sadie to the door. "Well, Fox," said Alain, "we'd better get on with it. Let's have Mr. Francis Ormerin, and you'd better inquire after that Seacliff." Fox went out. "This case seems to be strewn with upheavals," said Alain. "Garcia was sick when he saw the defaced portrait, Sonia was sick in the mornings, and Miss Seacliff is heaving away merrily at this very moment, or I'm much mistaken." Fox returned with Francis Ormerin, and once again they got down to routine. Ormerin had attended the private view of the Phoenix Group show on Friday night, and had spent the weekend with a French family at Hampstead. They had sat up until about 2 o'clock on both nights, and had been together during the day. "I understand that during the bus drive back from London yesterday the model sat beside you. Did she say anything about her movements in London?" "She told me that she stayed with another girl who is in the chorus of a vaudeville show at the Chelsea Theatre. It is called Snappy. Bobby is the name of the friend. Bobby O'Dorn." "Did she say anything at all that could be of any help to us?" "I don't think so. Except one thing, perhaps. She said that I must not be surprised if I learn soon of another engagement." "What engagement was that?" "She would not tell me. I received the impression, however, that it would be to Garcia." "I see. She did not talk about Garcia's movements on Friday." "But I think she did," exclaimed Ormerin. "She said Garcia would start for his promenade through this county on Saturday morning and return to work in London in a week's time." "Did she say where his workroom was in London?" "On the contrary, she asked me if I could tell her this. She said I do not know what his idea is to make such a mystery of it. She spoke with the air of a woman who has certain rights over a man. It may, of course, have been an assumption, but always she was looking at Garcia. Monsieur Alain, I have seen him return her look, and there was that in his eyes that made one shudder. It was not at all pretty to see him watching her." "She was on rather uncertain terms with most of you, it appears." Yes, but one does not perform murders through exasperation. Even Mamsie." Ormerin hesitated, grimaced, wagged his head sideways, and was silent. "What about Mr. Marmsley?" asked Alain lightly. "She was laughing at him. On the morning of our experiment, when Marmsley began to tease Sonia, pretending that the knife was still there, she entreated him to leave her alone, and when he would not, she said, 'I wouldn't be too damn funny. Where is it that you discover your ideas? Is it in books or pictures?' He was very disconcerted, and allowed his dirty brush to fall on his drawing. That is all." When Ormarin had gone, Alain wandered about the room whistling under his breath and paid no attention at all to Fox or Nigel.
"Look here," said Nigel at last. "I want to use a telephone."
"You?"
"Yes, don't look at me as though I was a fabulous monster. I want to use the telephone, I say." "You're burning to ring up your odious newspaper."
"You may say that there has been a fatal accident at Tatter's End House, Bossicott, and that an artist's model has died as the result of this accident. You may add that the authorities are unable to trace the whereabouts of the victim's relatives and are anxious to communicate with Mr. W. Garcia, who is believed to be on a walking tour and may be able to give them some information about the model's family." Something on those lines. "If Garcia is not our man," continued Alain to Fox, "and sees that, he may do something about it." "That's so," said Fox. "And now we'll deal with the last of this collection, if you please, Fox. The languishing Malmsley."
"I'll go to the telephone," said Nigel.
"Very well. You may tell them that there will be a further instalment tomorrow, and Bathgate, you might ring my mamma up and say we won't be in until after midnight."
"All right."
Nigel and Fox collided in the doorway with Bailey, who looked cold and disgruntled. "Hello," said Alain. "Wait a moment, Fox. Let's hear what Bailey's been up to."
"I've been over the deceased's room," said Bailey. "There's deceased's prints, and one that looks like this Garcia. It's inside the door where the maid's missed with the duster, and there's another print close beside it that isn't either of them. Broad, man's print, I'd say, and of course there are the maid's all over the show. I've checked those. Nothing much about the clothes. Note from Garcia in a pocket. She was in the family way, all right."
He opened his case and from a labelled envelope drew out a piece of paper laid between two slips of glass. Alain took the slips delicately in his fingers and laid them on the desk.
"Dear S, what do you expect me to do about it? I've got £2 to last me till I get to Troy's."
"You asked for it anyway.
Can't you get somebody to fix things? It's not exactly likely that I should want to be saddled with a wife and kid, is it? I've got a commission for a big thing, and for God's sake, don't throw me off my stride. I'm sorry, but I can't do anything. See you at Troy's. Garcia."
"A charming fellow," said Alain. "That was in a jacket pocket. Here's a letter that was just kicking about at the back of the wardrobe. Somebody called Bobby." This letter was written in an enormous hand on dreadful pink paper.
"Dear Sonia, I'm sorry you're in for it, dear. I think it's just frightful. I do think men are the limit. But of course, I never liked the sound of that Garcia. Too far upstage, if you ask me. But they're all alike when it comes to a girl. Same to you with bells on. And pleased to join in the fun at the start. And sorry you've been troubled. This takes me off. When they know you're growing melons. I've asked Dolores Duval for the address she went to when she had a spot of trouble, but she says the police found out about that lady, so it's no go. Anyway, I think your idea is better, and if Mr. Artistic Garcia is willing, okay, and why not, dear? You might as well get it both ways, and I suppose it's all right to be married. He sounds a lovely boy, but you never do know with that sort. Did I ever tell you about my boyfriend who was a lord? He was a scream, really, but nothing ever came of that, thank God. It will be okay if you come here on Friday. I might ask Cohen for a brief out. You know what managements are like these days. Dear, they sweat the socks off you for the basic salary. And when it comes to asking for a brief for a lady friend, it's just too bad, but they've forgotten how the chorus goes in that number. Thank you very much. Good morning. I laughed till I sobbed over the story of the Seacliff women's picture. It must have looked a scream when you'd done with it. But all the same, dear, your temperament will land you well in the consomme one of these days, dear, if you don't learn to curb yourself, which God knows you haven't done, what with one thing and another. What a yell about marmalade's little bit of dirt. Well, so long, dear. Keep smiling. See you Friday. Hoping this finds you well as I am. Cheerio, ever so sincerely, your old pal Bobby. P.S. You want to be sure BP won't turn nasty and say, all right, go ahead, I've told her the story of my life anyhow, so now what? Nigel returned while Alain was still chuckling over Miss O'Dorn's letter. What's up? Asked Nigel. Bailey has discovered a rich plum. I fancy it's the sort of thing your paper calls a human document. A gem in its own way. Nigel read over Fox's shoulder. I shall have to see Miss Bobby O'Dorn. She may be the girl we all wait for. Anything else, Bailey? Well, said Bailey grudgingly, I found this. He took out of his case a shabby blue book and handed it to Alain. There's several of the deceased's prints and a few of the broad one I got off the door. Same party had tried to get into the case where I found the book.
The Consolations of a Critic, Alain muttered, turning the book over. By C. Lewis Hind, 1911. Nice reproductions. Hello. Why, stab me and sink me, there it is. He had come upon a black-and-white reproduction of a picture in which 3 medieval figures mowed a charming field against a background of hayricks, pollard willows, and turreted palaces. By gum and gosh, Bailey, you found Mr. Malmsley's secret. I knew I'd met these 3 nice little men before. This is the explanation of one of the more obscure passages in the O'Dorn's document. What a yell about Marmalade's bit of dirt. What a yell indeed. Fetch him in, Fox. Bailey, you've done extremely well. Malmsley drifted in ahead of Fox, looking sufficiently remarkable with his beard divided into 2. He wore a crimson shirt, a black tie, and a corduroy velvet jacket. Indeed, he had the uncanny appearance of a person who had come round full circle to the Victorian idea of a bohemian. "Ah, Mr. Alain," he said, "you are painfully industrious." Alain smiled vaguely and invited Malmsley to sit down. Nigel returned to the desk. Bailey walked over to the door. Fox stood in massive silence by the dying fire. "Mr. Malmsley, you told us that Garcia asked you if—" Alain consulted his notebook. "If you had ever felt like murdering your mistress just for the horror of doing it, how did you reply?" "I replied that I'd never been long enough attached to a woman for her to claim the title of my mistress." "Is he at all insane, do you think?" "Insane? My dear Inspector, who can define the borders of abnormality?" "That is quite true," said Alain patiently. "Is he in the habit of taking drugs, do you know?" "I really have no idea." "You've never noticed his eyes, for instance?" continued Alain, looking fixedly into Malmsley's. "One can usually tell, you know, by the eyes. The pupils are contracted. Later on they occasionally become widely dilated, as you must have observed, Mr. Malmsley, when you have looked in a mirror." "Your methods are singularly transparent, Inspector. You wish to know if I've ever amused myself by exploring the pleasures of opium? I have done so. A friend has given me a very beautiful set in jade and ivory, and I have not been so churlish as to neglect its promise of enjoyment. On the other hand, I have not allowed myself to contract a habit." "Did you invite Garcia to smoke opium?" "Yes." "When?" "Last Friday afternoon." "At last," said Alain. "Where did you smoke your opium?" "In the studio." "You had the 6 o'clock bus to catch. Surely you felt disinclined to make the trip up to London." Malmsley moved restlessly. "As a matter of fact," he said, "I did not smoke a full pipe. I merely started one and gave it to Garcia." "How many pipes did you give him?" "Only one." "Very well. When you finally left the studio," said Alain, "what was Mr. Garcia's condition?" "He was very tranquil. He said that there was a way out of all one's difficulties if one only had the courage to take it." "Did you take your opium and the pipe back to the house?" "No. The housemaid had said something about changing the sheets on my bed. I didn't particularly want to encounter her." "Where did you put the things, then?" "In a box under Garcia's bed." "And collected them?" "This morning before class." "Had they been disturbed?" "I've no idea." "Do you think Garcia may have smoked again after you left?" "Again, I have no idea." Alain looked curiously at Malmsley. "I wonder," he said, "if you realize what you may have done. What you have told me points almost too startlingly to only one conclusion." Malmsley made a sudden and violent gesture of repudiation. "That is a horrible suggestion," he said. "I have told you the truth. You have no right to suggest that I had any other motives, but... "I think I appreciate your motives well enough, Mr. Malmsley. We shall, of course, verify your statements. I have looked at your illustrations, Mr. Malmsley. They are charming." "You share my pleasure in them?" said Malmsley, rallying a little. I particularly liked the picture of the three little men with scythes. Malmsley looked sharply at Alain. Have you ever visited Chantilly? Asked Alain. Never. Then you have not seen Le Très Riche Heure de Duc de Berry? Never. Do you remember a book called The Consolations of a Critic? I don't remember. Do you own a copy of this book? No, Alain picked up the little blue volume from under his chair and laid it on Malmsley's knee. Isn't this book your property, Mr. Malmsley? It has your name on the flyleaf. I'm not here to inquire into the ethics of illustrative painting. All I want to know is how this book came into the possession of Sonia Gluck. I don't know. I'm not in the least ashamed. There are many dissimilarities. That is what she was driving at when she asked you on the morning of the experiment where you got your ideas? Yes, I suppose so, yes. Did you ask her for the book? Yes. And when she refused to give it up, you tried to recover it. Where was this book, Bailey? In a locked suitcase under deceased's bed. Someone had tried to pick the lock. Was that you, Mr. Malmsley? I was entirely justified. What was Sonia's motive in taking this book? She simply wanted to be disagreeable and infuriating. Did you offer her anything if she returned it? She was preposterous, muttered Malmsley. How much did she ask? I do not admit that she asked anything. All right, said Alain. It's your mess. Stay in it if you want to. I believe I need not keep you any longer, Mr. Malmsley. I shall need a specimen of your fingerprints. Malmsley consented to this with a very ill grace. One more job for you, Bailey, I'm afraid, said Alain when Malmsley had gone. We'll have to look through their rooms before we let them go to bed. I'll start off on Mr. Malmsley's room, will I, sir? Yes, we'll be there in a jiffy. When Fox had gone upstairs and Nigel had been left to write a very guarded story for his paper, Alain went down the hall and into the dining room. He found the whole class in a state of extreme dejection. Troy was curled up on a cushion, fast asleep. Alain walked swiftly across the room and paused, his head bent down, his eyes on Troy. Her face looked thin. There were small shadows in the hollows of her temples and under her eyes. She frowned, her hands moved, and suddenly she was awake. I'm so sorry, said Alain. Oh, it's you, said Troy. Do you want me? Please, only for a moment. Troy sat up. She rose, but lost her balance. Alain put his arm out quickly. For a moment, he supported her. My legs have gone to sleep. Damn. Her hand was on his shoulder. He held her firmly by the arms and wondered if it was Troy or he who trembled. I'm all right now, she said after an hour, or a second. Thank you. He let her go and spoke to the others. I am very sorry to keep you all up for so long. We have had a good deal to do. Before you go to your rooms, we should like to have a glance at them. I hope nobody objects to this. Anything, if we can only go to bed, said Catty. Very well, then, if you... He turned to Troy. Wouldn't mind coming with me? Yes, of course. When they were in the hall, he stopped short. I detest my job, he said. For the first time, I despise and detest it. Come on, said Troy. They went up to a half landing where the stairs separated into two short flights going up to the left and right. Before I forget, said Alain, do you know what has happened to the bottle of nitric acid that was on the top shelf in the junk room? Troy stared at him. The acid? It's there. It was filled up on Friday. Bailey must have missed it. Don't worry. We saw the stains and we felt we ought to account for them. You better do my room. Here it is. They went into the second room on the left-hand landing. It was a large room, very spacious and well-proportioned. The walls, the carpet, and the narrow bed were white. He saw only one picture and very few ornaments, but on the mantelpiece sparkled a little glass Christmas tree with fabulous glass flowers growing on it. Troy struck a match and lit the fire. I'll leave you to your job. Alain did not answer. Is there anything else? asked Troy. Only that I should like to say that if it was possible for me to make an exception— Why should you make any exceptions? Interrupted Troy. There is no conceivable reason for such a suggestion. If you will simply think of me as a ship's steward or some other sexless official— How else should I think of you, Mr. Alleyne? I can assure you there is no need for these scruples, if they are scruples. They were attempts at an apology. I shall make a third and ask you to forgive me for my impertinence. I shan't keep you long. Troy turned at the door. I didn't mean to be beastly, she said. Nor were you. I see now that I made an insufferable assumption. But you can hardly expect me to be genial when you are about to hunt through my undergarments for incriminating letters. The very fact that you suspect— Alleyne strode to the door and looked down at her. You little fool, he said. Haven't you the common or garden gumption to see that I no more suspect you than the girl in the moon? Troy stared at him as if he had taken leave of his senses. She opened her mouth to speak, said nothing, turned on her heel and left the room. Blast, said Alleyne. Oh, blast and hell and bloody stink. He stood and looked at the door which Troy had only just not slammed. Then he turned to his job. There was a bow-fronted chest of drawers full of the sort of garments that Alleyne often before had had to turn over. His thin, fastidious hands touched them delicately, laid them in neat heaps on the bed, and returned them carefully to their appointed places. There was a little drawer, rather untidy, where Troy kept her oddments. 1 or 2 letters, one that began, Troy darling, and was signed, Your foolishly devoted John. Then there were the dresses in the wardrobe, the slim jackets, Troy's smart evening dresses, and her shabby old slacks. Such odd things she kept in her pockets, bits of charcoal, India rubbers, and a sketchbook crammed into a pocket that was too small for it. He slipped his hand into a pocket of a blue coat and pulled out Catty Bostock's letter. You are a gump to collect these bloodsuckers. He's a nasty little animal. That little devil, Sonia Gluck. Your allusions to a detective are quite incomprehensible, but if he interrupted you in your work, you had every right to bite his head off. The envelope was addressed to Troy at the Chateau Frontenac. Evidently, thought Alleyne, I'd begun to make a nuisance of myself on board, interrupting her work. Oh, Lord. In a minute or two he had finished. He hung up the last garment, glanced round the room, and looked for the 4th or 5th time at the photograph of a man that stood on the top of the bow-fronted chest. A good-looking man who had signed himself John. Alleyne, yielding to an unworthy impulse, made a hideous grimace at this photograph, turned to leave the room, and saw Troy, amazed, in the doorway. He felt his face burning like a sky sign. Have you finished, Mr. Alleyne? Quite finished, thank you. He knew she had seen him. There was a singular expression in her eyes. I have just made a face at the photograph on your tall boy, said Alleyne. So I observed. I have gone through your clothes, fished in your pockets, and read all your letters. You may go to bed. The house will be watched, of course. Good night, Miss Troy. Good morning, Mr. Alleyne. Alleyne went to Catty Bostock's room, where he found nothing of note. The only personal letter he found was the one Troy had written and posted at Vancouver. He came to the passages about himself. Turned out to be intelligent, so I felt the fool. And looks like a grandee. I'm rather on the defensive about this sleuth. And he took it like a gent and made me feel like a bounder. As he read, Alleyne's left eyebrow climbed up his forehead. He folded the letter very carefully, smoothed it out, and returned it to its place among a box of half-used oil colours. He began to whistle under his breath, polished off Catty Bostock's effects, and went in search of Fox and Bailey. Fox had found Malmsley's opium-smoking impedimenta and had impounded them. The amount of opium was small. "Has Bailey tried these things for prints?" asked Alleyne. "Yes, 2 sets. Garcia's and Malmsley's on the pipe, the lamp and the jar." "The jar, that's interesting. Well, let's get on with it." He sent Bailey into Phila-de-Lee's room while he and Fox tackled Valmay Seacliff's. Miss Seacliff's evening bag containing, among other things, a half-full bottle of aspirin. Maybe pilgrims, said Alain, and put them in his case. Now, for the correspondence. They found more than enough of that. 2 of her dressing-table drawers were filled with neatly tied-up packets of letters. Help, said Alain. Here, you take this lot. Very special. Red ribbon. Must be pilgrims, I imagine. Yes, they are. Fox put on his spectacles and began impassively to read Basil Pilgrim's love letters. For some time there was no sound but the faint crackle of notepaper. Bailey came in, and Alain threw a bundle of letters at him. There's something here you might like to see, said Fox. The last one from the Honourable Mr. Pilgrim. Men like Garcia have no right to be in the same room as yourself, my lovely, terrifyingly remote Valmay. I know people scream with mirth at the sound of the word pure. It's gone all déclassé, like genteel, but there is a strange sort of purity about you, Valmay, truly. If I've understood you, you've seen something of... God, this sounds frightful. Something of the same sort of quality in me. Yes, I see. Any letters in Pilgrim's room? None. He may have taken them to Angerton Manor, Chief. So he may. Any aspirin? No. I fancy I found his bottle in one of Miss Seacliffe's pockets. Come on, let's get on with it. Presently Bailey said, Here's one from Garcia. Like the note to Sonia, this was written in pencil on an odd scrap of paper. It was not dated or addressed, and the envelope was missing. Dear Valmay, I hear you're going to Troyes this term. So am I. I'm broke. I haven't got the price of the fare down, and I want 1 or 2 things. Paints, mostly. I've got to paint for a bit. I took the liberty of going into Gibson's and getting a few things on your account. I told old Gibson it would be all right, and he'd see me in the shop with you, so it was. Do you think Basil Pilgrim would lend me a £5, or would you? I'll be okay when Troy gets back, and I've got a good commission, so the money's all right. If I don't hear from you, I'll ask Pilgrim. Can't think of anyone else. Is it true you're going to hitch up with Pilgrim? Much better try a spot of free love with me. Gee. All right, then, we'll pack up, said Alain. Fox, you might tell them all they may turn in now. My compliments and so on. Come on, Bathgate. A few minutes later they all met in the hall. Alain had a last look round and spoke to the local man who was to remain on duty in the hall. By the way, where's the garage? Round the house to the right, sir. Thank you. Good night. It was a still, cold night with no moon. The gravel crunched loudly under their feet. I've just got to have a look at the garage, said Alain. I've got the key from a nail in the lobby. I won't be long. Give me my case, Bailey. Bathgate, you drive on. He switched on his torch and followed the drive round the house to an old stables yard. The 4 loose boxes had been converted into garages, and his key fitted all of them. He found an Austin and a smart supercharged sports car. Pilgrims, thought Alain. And in the last garage, a small motor caravan. Alain muttered when he saw this. He examined the tire treads, measured the distance between the wheels, and took the height from the ground to the rear doorstep. He opened the door and climbed in. There were 2 bunks, a folding table, a cupboard, and plenty of lockers. He looked into the lockers and found painting gear and 1 or 2 canvases. He took one out. Troyes, he said. Then he looked at the petrol gauge and found it registered only 2 gallons. He began to look very closely at the floor. On the doorstep he found 2 dark indentations. Have they remembered your hot water bottle, sir, and what time would you wish to be called? Fox, said Alain. I am sorry. Have I been very long? Oh, no, sir. Bert Bailey's in his beauty sleep in the back of our car, and Mr. Bathgate has gone off in his to her ladyship's. Fox, we'll seal up this caravan, and then we really will go home. Look here, you send Bailey back to London and stay the night with us. My mother will be delighted. I'll lend you some pyjamas, and we'll snatch a few hours' sleep and start early in the morning. Well, sir, that's very kind of you. I'd be very pleased. Alain sealed the caravan doors with tape and then the door of the garage. He put the key in his pocket. No little jaunts for them tomorrow, he said coolly. Come along, Fox. Golly, it's cold. They saw Bailey, arranged to meet him at the yard in the morning, and drove back to Dane's Lodge. Alain and Fox were back at Tatler's End House at 7 o'clock in the thin, chilly light of dawn. The two men went straight to the studio, where they found a local constable wrapped in his overcoat. "How long have you been here?" asked Alain.
Since 10 o'clock last night, sir. I'll be relieved fairly soon. 8 o'clock with any luck. Sir, if you're going to work here, I'd like to look on. If it's not a liberty, sir.
"By all means. What's your name?"
Sligo, sir.
"Right. Come along." Alain led them to the studio window. "Last night," said Alain, "we noticed certain marks on this windowsill and at the top of the stool here." He produced a thin steel tape and measured the distance between the indentations. "Lock this place up and come along outside," he said to the constable. In the lane, Alain showed them the traces left by the wheels. "Observe the tread, Sligo. There, you see, is the clear impression of a patch. I'll measure the distance between the wheels and the width of the tyres. A little oil has dripped on the road. The van, or whatever it is, has been recently greased. Now, come along to the garage." Alain unlocked the garage doors and broke the police tape. It had begun to rain. "I took some measurements here last night, but it would be as well to verify them. Suppose you have a stab at it, Sligo." Sligo, intensely gratified, measured the width of the tyres and the wheelbase.
"The tyres are the same, sir."
"Good," said Alain. "Now take a look at the doorstep."
"There they are, sir. There they are. Same marks on the top step."
"I think so. Check them to make sure." Out came Sligo's tape again. "It's them for sure," he said. "How far is it from here to London?"
20 miles exactly, sir, to the end of the drive from Shepherd's Bush," answered Sligo promptly.
"Right. Seal the garage up again, will you, Fox? Blast this weather. We'd better have a look at Pilgrim's car." Basil Pilgrim's car was a very smart, supercharged two-seater. The upholstery smelt definitely of Valmay Seacliff, and one of the side pockets contained an elaborate set of cosmetics. They opened the dicky and found a man's rather shabby raincoat. Alain examined it carefully and sniffed at it. Very powerful scent that young woman uses. Now then, Sligo, you have a look at this. How about giving me a running commentary on an old raincoat?" Sligo, breathing noisily, took the coat in his enormous hands.
"It's a man's mackintosh," he began. "Made by Burberry, marked B. Pilgrim, inside collar. It's mucked up like and stained. Inside a collar, bit greasy, and it's got white marks too on it. Grease on one sleeve. Pockets, right hand. A pair of old gloves used likely for changing tyres. There's other marks too. Reckon he's done something to battery sometime."
"Well done," said Alain. "Go on." Sligo turned the gloves inside out.
"Left hand inside got small dark stain on edge of palm under base of little finger. Left hand pocket. Piece of greasy rag. Box of matches."
Sligo turned the coat over and over.
"I can't see anything more, sir, except a bit of a hole in right hand cuff. Burnt by cigarette, likely. That's all, sir."
Alain shut his notebook. "That's the method," he said. "But," he glanced at his watch, "good Lord, it's 8 o'clock. You better cut back to the studio, or your relief will be giving you a bad mark."
"Thank you very much, sir. Much obliged, sir. It's been a fair treat."
"That's all right. Where you go?" Sligo pounded off. Leaving Fox at the garage, Alain walked round the house and rang the front doorbell. It was answered by a constable. "Good morning. Do you know if Miss Troy is down yet?"
"She's in the library, sir."
Troy, in slacks and a pullover, looked as if she had not slept. "I'm very sorry indeed to worry you at the crack of dawn. I want to ask you if the caravan in the garage belongs to you."
"Yes, why?"
"When did you last use it, please?"
About a fortnight ago. We all went out in it to Catswood for a picnic and a day's sketching."
"Do you know how much petrol there was in the tank when you got back?"
"Must have been more than half full, I should think. I got it filled up when we started, and we only went about 40 miles there and back."
"What does she do to the gallon?"
20.
"And the tank holds—"
8 gallons.
"Yes, it's just over a quarter full this morning." Troy stared at him. Then, as her eyes widened,
"Garcia," she cried out. "You think Garcia took it, don't you?"
"What makes you so sure of that?"
"Why, because I've puzzled my own wits half the night to think how he got his stuff away. The superintendent here told me none of the local carriers knew anything about it. Of course Garcia took it. Trust him not to pay a carrier if he could get his stuff there free.
If this warehouse place is somewhere in London, he could do the trip easily if it were late at night, couldn't he?
Yes, dear me, I shall have to do a sum. Your car does 20 to the gallon and holds 8 gallons. You went 40 miles, starting with a full tank. Therefore, there should be 6 gallons, and there are only about 3. That leaves a discrepancy of 60 miles or so. I do wish he'd told one of you where this damned warehouse was.
But he did. At least Seacliff said this morning she thought she remembered he said something about it being near Holloway. Good Lord, why didn't she say so last night? Why does she always behave in the most tiresome manner one could possibly conceive? Oh, I'm nearly as bad, not to have told you at once.
You are nothing like as bad. Troy rang the bell, which was answered by Hipkin, a large man with a small head and flat feet. Ask Miss Seacliff if she'll come and see me. Seacliff strolled in, dressed in black trousers and a magenta sweater. Good morning, Miss Seacliff, said Alleyne.
Do you want to be alone, Mr. Alleyne?
Asked Troy.
No, I just want to ask Miss Seacliff about this Holloway business. Oh, said Seacliff, you mean the place where Garcia's going to sculp?
Yes. Did he tell you it was somewhere near Holloway?
Yes, he did. I'd forgotten. He asked me if I would come and see him while he was working. Then he said it was near Holloway because I remember I asked him if he thought he'd be safe. I said I knew better than to spend an afternoon with him in a deserted studio, but I might get Basil to drive me there. And, of course, that made him quite livid with rage.
Did he tell you exactly where it was?
He drew up a map, but I'm afraid I've lost it.
Then I think that's all, thank you, Miss Seacliff. She got up, frowned, and closed her eyes for a moment. What's the matter? Asked Troy.
I've got another of these filthy headaches. I've been getting them lately.
You're looking a bit white, said Troy more kindly. Why don't you lie down? Would you like some aspirin?
Basil gave me his last night, thanks.
She took out her mirror and looked at herself with intense concentration.
I look bloody,
she said, and walked out of the room. She always like that? Asked Alleyne.
Pretty much. She's spoiled. She'd have been comparatively easy to live with if she hadn't got that lovely face. She is beautiful, you know.
Oh, magnificent, agreed Alleyne absently. He was looking at Troy, at the delicate sparseness of her head, the straight line of her brows, and the generous width between her grey-green eyes. I must get on with my odious job, he said. May I use your telephone?
Yes, of course.
He turned at the doorway and said, Lady Alleyne's compliments to Miss Troy, and if Miss Troy would like to sample the amenities of Dane's Lodge, Lady Alleyne will be very happy to offer them.
Your mother is very kind, said Troy, but I think it would be better not. Will you thank her from me? Please say I am very grateful indeed.
Alleyne bowed.
I'm grateful to you too, said Troy.
Are you?
That is rather dangerously nice of you.
Goodbye. Alleyne found Fox, who had renewed his acquaintance with the Hipkins and Sadie, and drove him back through the teeming rain to Dane's Lodge for breakfast. I've had a bit of a yarn with Ethel Jones, said Fox. Ethel? Oh, yes, the help from the village. What has she got to say for herself?
Well, sir, it seems that Ethel and her boy took a walk on Friday night down the lane. They passed by the studio window on their way home from the pictures at about 11:30. There were lights going in the studio, but the blind was down. They stopped in the shadow of the trees to have a bit of a cuddle, as you might put it. Ethel says she glanced down the lane and saw someone outside the studio window.
Did she, by gum?
She says he seemed to be wearing a raincoat and a cap or beret of some sort. He was standing quite close to the window, Ethel reckons, and was caught by a streak of light coming through the blind. I asked her about the face, of course, but she says it was in shadow. She remembers that there was a small patch of light on the cap.
There's a hole in the blind, said Alleyne. Is that so, sir?
Well, that might account for it, then. Ethel says the rest of the figure was in shadow. She says the man turned aside and disappeared into the darker shadow, and they could just hear his footfall as he walked away. Well, I went into the lane to see if I could pick up his prints, but this downpour about finished the lane as far as we're concerned.
I know. Anything else?
No, they ambled off home.
Hello, sir, what's up? Alain had pulled up and now began to turn the car in the narrow lane. "Sorry, Fox, but we're going back to have a look at the hole in the blind." And back to the studio they went. Alain tied a thread to the light nearest the window and stretched the thread through the hole to Fox, who drew it tight and held it against his diaphragm. "You see?" said Alain. "Yes," said Fox. "I'm 6'2" in my socks, and it hits me somewhere, let's see, about the end of the sternum." "That's right, sir." "Good enough. But we'll take a look at night. Let's go and have breakfast." And a few minutes later they joined Nigel Bathgate at breakfast. "You might have told me you were going out," complained Nigel. "I wouldn't dream of interrupting your beauty sleep," said Alain. "We're for London in 20 minutes. May I come with you? I've telephoned the office. I'll make a bit of an entrance with this story." In the car, Alain and Fox thumbed over their notebooks and occasionally exchanged remarks. Nigel, next to the chauffeur, spent the time in pleasurable anticipation of his reception at the office. They cut through from Shepherd's Bush to Holland Road, and thence into Chelsea. Alain gave the man directions which finally brought them into a narrow and not very smart cul-de-sac behind Smith Street. "You can put me down here," said Alain. "Goodbye, Bathgate. Meet you at the yard somewhere round noon, Fox." He waved his hand and crossed the street to a set of flats that only just escaped the appearance of a lodging-house. Alain inspected the row of yellowing cards inside the front door. Miss Bobby O'Dawn's room was up 2 flights. He passed the inevitable charwoman with her bucket of oil and soot, and tapped at Miss O'Dawn's door. A voice called out, "All right!" There were bumping noises, followed by the sound of bare feet on thin carpet. "Who is it?" "May I speak to Miss O'Dawn?" called Alain. "I've an important message for her." "For me?" said the voice in more refined accents. "Wait a moment, please." The door opened a few inches and then widely enough to admit the passage of a mop of sulphur-coloured curls and a not unattractive face. "I'm sorry to disturb you so early," said Alain. "It's about Sonia Gluck." Miss O'Dawn's bed-sitting room looked a little as if it had been suddenly slapped up and bounced into a semblance of tidiness. "Sit down," she said, "and make yourself at our place. It's not Buckingham Palace with knobs on, but you can't do much on chorus work, and hello, girls, have you heard the news? I was going to make a cup of coffee. How does that strike you?" "It sounds delightful," said Alain. She lit her gas ring and clapped a saucepan over it. "By the way, you haven't told me who you are." "My name's Roderick Alain. I'm afraid—" "Roderick Alain sounds pretty good. Well, if you'll excuse my freshness, you look a bit more Eton and Oxford than most of Sonia's boyfriends. Are you an artist?" "No, I'm a policeman." "A policeman? Oh, go on, you're kidding." "Miss O'Dawn, I'm an official of Scotland Yard." She looked sharply at him. "Here, what's wrong?" she said. "Was Miss Gluck a very close friend of yours?" asked Alain gently. "Was? What do you mean, was? Here, has anything happened to Sonia?" "I'm afraid so." "Oh, God, she's not—" "Yes." Her pert little face had gone white under the makeup. "What had she done?" she said. "She hadn't done anything. I think I know what you mean. She was going to have a child." "Yes, I know that all right. Well, what happened?" Alain told her as kindly as possible. She made the coffee as she listened to him, and her distress was so unaffected that he felt himself warm to her. "God, I can't believe it. Murdered." She stirred her coffee and stared at Alain. Suddenly she made a jab at him with her spoon. "Garcia," she said. Alain waited. "She brought him up here once or twice, and I said to her, 'You watch your business with that gentleman.' I said, 'In my opinion, he's a very dirty bit of work, and I don't mind who hears me.' Well, I mean to say, letting a girl as good as keep him. And when the spot of trouble comes along, it's thanks for the buggy ride, it was okay while it lasted. Had she tried the funny business with the kid? You know?" "I don't think so." Alain took Miss O'Dawn's letter from his pocket and handed it to her. "We found this in her room. I think I may as well tell you that we know she got £100 from Mr. Basil Pilgrim." "Did he tell you?" "Yes." "Was that the plan you refer to in this letter?"
Since you're asking, Mr. Clever, it was. Pilgrim's had his fun, and Sonia didn't see why he shouldn't pay for it.
But the child was not Pilgrim's.
Oh, no, dear, but for all he knew—
Yes, I see. What did she do with his cheque?
Oh, she cashed it and gave the money to Garcia, dear. Asked him if they couldn't get married straight away, and Garcia said 100 quid wasn't enough to marry with.
Hadn't she got anything out of Malmsley?
Listen, Mr. Blake, aren't you wonderful? How did you get onto the marmalade stuff?
Alleyne folded his arms and raised his eyebrows. I have my methods. What happened when she offered to sell Malmsley his own book?
Wouldn't give more than £5, dear, and Sonia stuck out for 20. She said she'd give him the weekend to think it over. She didn't mind waiting. It wasn't as if she hadn't got—
Miss O'Dorn stopped short, gave Alleyne another of her sharp glances, and lit a cigarette. Hadn't got what? Asked Alleyne.
Look here. What's wrong with a girl getting her own back like Sonia did?
Well, it was blackmail, you know.
Was it? Isn't that a pity, I don't suppose? Look, Roddy, you don't mind me calling you Roddy, do you?
I'm delighted, said Alleyne.
Well, look, if what Sonia did was blackmail, I don't want to let everybody know the dirt about her after she's gone.
You don't want her murderer to get off, do you?
Do I look funny?
Well, then, had Garcia any more tricks up his sleeve? Miss O'Dorn twisted her fingers together. If you know anything more about Garcia, I do beg of you to tell me what it is.
Yeah, and get a permanent shop where Sonia's gone. It's no good, dear. I'm not in on this act.
I promise you that no harm—
No, dear, there's nothing doing. Have you arrested him?
No, he's gone on a walking tour.
That's a scream. I bloody well don't think. Pardon my refinement, said Miss O'Dorn.
Alleyne went thoughtfully to Scotland Yard. He saw his assistant commissioner and went over the case with him. Then he went to his office. Presently Fox came in. Alleyne related the gist of his interview with Miss O'Dorn. "What about yourself?" he asked when he had finished. "Any news, Brer Fox?"
The city's been set going on the warehouse business. It's a bit of a job and no mistake. According to Miss Troy's reckoning, we've got 60 miles to account for. It's 20 miles to Shepherd's Bush from the house, there and back 40. Of course, he might not have come in by the Uxbridge Road, but it's by far the most direct route, and it would be the one he was familiar with. That leaves us a radius of 10 miles, roughly, from Shepherd's Bush to wherever the warehouse is. As the crow flies, Holloway Prison is only about 5 miles from Shepherd's Bush, but the shortest way by road would be nearer 9. Of course, it's all very loose, added Fox, looking over his spectacles at Alleyne, but so's our information.
Very loose. Well, Fox, we'd better get a move on. We're going to spend a jolly day checking up alibis. I'll take Miss Troy's and Miss Bostock's to begin with. You start off with young Hatchett and Phillida Lee. If we get done today, we'll run down to Boxover in the morning and see the people with whom Pilgrim and Miss Seacliff stayed on Friday night. He opened a drawer in his desk and took out the photograph of the group at Tatler's End House. "How tall is Garcia?" he asked. 5'9", according to the statement Blackman gave us, yes. Pilgrim looks about 2.5 inches taller in this photograph, doesn't he? Ormeron, Hatchett, and Garcia all are within an inch of each other. Miss Bostock, Miss Seacliff, and Miss Lee are much shorter. The model is a little taller than Miss Bostock, but not as tall as the others. Miss Troy is taller than the first batch, but about 2 inches shorter than Pilgrim. Pilgrim is the tallest of the lot. The desk telephone rang. "It's me," said Nigel's voice winningly. "I'd like to come and see you, Alleyne." "Very well, come up. I've got a job for you." Alleyne hung up the receiver. "It's Bathgate. I'll send him round to get an exclusive story from Miss Bobby O'Dorn. There's just a remote hope she may become less discreet under the influence of free publicity. I'm damn well positive she's keeping something up her sleeve about the blackmailing activities." He moved restlessly about the room. "Something missing," he said. "I'm positive there's something missing. Let's get Bailey's further report on the print, shall we?" Alleyne rang through to Bailey's department. In a minute or two he appeared with a quantity of photographs which he laid on Alleyne's desk. "These are from the empty whisky bottle under Garcia's bed, the stool he used for his work, and the windowsill. These," he pointed to a second group, "come from bits of clay that were lying about the floor. They're made by the same fingers as the first lot. I've marked them Garcia. Here's the ones off the opium box and the pipe. 4 of those I've identified as Mr. Malmsley's. The others are Garcia's."
Here's a photograph of the clay pellet I found in the drape. Garcia again. This sets off the edge of the throne. There were lots of prints there. Some of them Mr. Hatchett's, some of Mr. Pilgrim's, and some of the French blokes. This Mr. Ormerin. They seem to have had blue paint on their fingers, which was useful, but this set is Garcia's again, and I found it on top of the others. Bailey produced another photograph. I got that from the drape. Garcia, said Alain and Fox together. I reckon it is, said Bailey. We'd never have got it if it hadn't been for the clay. There's no prints on the knife, but there's a smudge of blue. You may remember there were the same blue smudges on the throne and the easel ledge that was used to hammer in the dagger. Now this print we got from the bit of paint rag that you suggested was used to wipe off the prints. Some of the paint on the rag was only half dry and took a good impression. It matches the paint smudges on the knife, blue. Garcia's. That's correct, sir. This about settles it, Mr. Alain, said Fox. That Garcia laid the trap, I agree with you, said Alain, and I'm going down to Brixton. Is that a joke? Asked Fox suspiciously. No, Fox. Brixton? Why Brixton? Sit down for a minute, said Alain, and I'll tell you. The following afternoon, Alain turned wearily into the last land and estate agent's office in Brixton. A young man advanced upon him. Yes, sir, what can I have the pleasure of doing for you? If you will, and if you can, tell me of any vacant warehouses in this district, or of any warehouses that have let part of themselves to artists. As you will probably have guessed, I'm an officer of Scotland Yard. Here's my card. I'd better show you my list of all the places I have already inspected. The list was a long one. The blond young man ran through it, muttering to himself. Now, there's Solly and Perkins, big place, and there's Anderson's Shirt Factory, and Lacker and Lampton's Used Car Depot, that's in Gulper Row, opposite the prison. Quite in your line, Inspector. He laughed shrilly. Damn funny, agreed Alain. Lacker and Lampton's foreman was in here the other day. He's taken a house from us. Now, he did say something about there being a lot of room round at their place. Could you give me the foreman's name? Macaulay's the name, Ted Macaulay. Thank you very much indeed, said Alain. He departed hurriedly. A fine drizzle had set in, and already the light had begun to fade. Alain turned up the collar of his raincoat, pulled down the brim of his hat, and strode off in the direction of Brixton Prison. Lacker and Lampton's was at the far end. It was a barn of a place, and the ground floor was half full of spare parts. Alain asked for Mr. Ted Macaulay, and in a minute or two a giant in oil-soaked dungarees came out of a smaller workshop, wiping his hands on a piece of waste. Yes, sir? He asked cheerfully. I'm looking for an empty room with a good light to use as a painting studio, Alain began. I called in at the estate agents. They said you might have something. Have you any vacant rooms that would do to paint in? Not here, we haven't, but it's a funny thing you should ask. You see, there's a bit of a storehouse round the corner that would do you down to the ground. Skylight, paraffin heater, electric light, plenty of room. It was taken by an artist like yourself, a gentleman by the name of Gregory. Is he in his studio this afternoon? Hasn't been there for 3 months. He's in Hong Kong. Indeed, murmured Alain. Would he sublet, do you know? I don't know whether he would, but he can't. He promised the loan of it to someone else. I see. Then somebody else is using it? That's where the funny part comes in. He isn't. Never turned up. What was this other man's name, do you know? Have I heard it now? Ruminated Mr. Macaulay, absently accepting one of Alain's cigarettes. Wait a bit now. It was a funny sort of name. Reminded me of the rubbish van. Garbage? Garbage. That's the name, or nearly. Something like Garcia, perhaps? That's it. Garcia. Look here, Alain said. I wish you'd just let me have a look at this place, will you, in case there is a chance of my getting it? Well, suppose there's nothing against that. Mr. Macaulay got a key from behind a door, hooked an old tarpaulin over his shoulders, and led the way out of the garage by a side door into a narrow alley. It was now raining heavily. Nasty weather, said Mr. Macaulay. It's only a step. They turned to the left into a wider lane. Macaulay stopped in front of a pair of rickety double doors fastened with a padlock and chain. Here we are, sir. Just half a tick and I'll have her open. She's a bit stiff.
The key grated in the lock, the chain rattled, and McCulley dragged the reluctant doors back in their grooves.
"Darkish," he said. "I'll turn up the light."
It was very dark inside, the far end quite lost in shadow. McCulley's hand fumbled along the wall. There was a click, and a dull yellow globe, thick with dust, came to life. A few canvases stood at intervals with their faces to the wall. Halfway down there was a large studio easel, and beyond it stood a packing case with a few odd chairs and some shadowy bundles. Beyond that again, deep in shadow, Alain could distinguish the corner of a table. An acrid smell hung on the air. McCulley walked on towards the dark.
"Kind of lonesome, isn't it?" he said. "Bit of a smell, too."
"Wait a moment," said Alain, but McCulley did not hear him.
"Cripes! What stink! You'd think it—"
His voice stopped. "McCulley, don't move." Alain strode swiftly down the room.
"There's someone sitting at the table,"
McCulley whispered. In the shadow cast by the packing case, Alain saw the table. The man who sat at it leant across the top and stared at them. His chin seemed to be on the surface of the table. His arms were stretched so far that his hands reached the opposite edge. Alain had a torch in his pocket. He groped for it. The sharp beam of light ended in the man's face. It was the face of a gargoyle. The eyeballs started from their sockets. The protruding tongue was sulphur yellow. The face was yellow and blue. Alain walked slowly towards the table. The area of light widened to take in an overturned cup and a bottle.
"Oh, God,"
said McCulley.
"Oh, God, help me! Oh, God!"
Alain turned McCulley round, marched him towards the door and propped him against the wall. He was sheet white and trembling. Alain looked up and down the alley. "Wait here a minute," he said. He ran through the pelting rain to the top of the alley, and about 200 yards away he saw a constable walking along the pavement towards him. Alain made himself known and sent the man off to the nearest telephone. Then he returned to McCulley. "It's all right, McCulley. Sit down on this box. Here." He pulled a flask from his pocket and made McCulley drink. "I'm sorry I let you in for this," he said. "Now wait here and don't admit anyone. When I've turned up the light at the back of this place, close the doors." Using his torch, Alain went back to the far end of the room. He found the light switch, turned it on, and heard McCulley drag the doors together. The body was flaccid. The man was dressed in an old mackintosh and a pair of shabby grey trousers. The hands were relaxed, but their position suggested that they had clutched the edge of the table. The square fingertips were lightly crusted with dry clay, and the right thumb and forefinger was streaked with blue. On the backs of the hands, Alain saw sulphur-coloured patches. The mouth was torn, and a glance at the fingernails showed by what means. On the chin, the table, and the floor, Alain found further ghastly evidence of what had happened before the man died. Alain dropped his silk handkerchief over the head. He looked at the overturned bottle and cup. The bottle was marked clearly with a label bearing a scarlet cross. The floor was littered with broken china and with curiously shaped wooden tools, rather like enormous orange sticks. Alain looked at the feet. The shoes, though shabby and unpolished, had no mud on them. One foot was twisted round the chair leg. The other had been jammed against the leg of the table. The whole posture suggested unspeakable torture. Alain turned to the packing case, pulled on his gloves and drew the bolt. The door opened smoothly, and inside the case, on a wheeled platform, was an irregularly shaped object that seemed to be swathed in cloths. Alain touched it. The cloths were still damp. "Comedy and tragedy," he murmured. He began to go over the floor. He found 1 or 2 strands of dark brown hair, and these he put in an envelope. Then he looked again at the head of the dead man. Voices sounded, the doors rattled open. Outside in the pouring rain was a police car and a mortuary van. Fox and Bailey stood in the doorway with McCulley. Alain walked quickly towards them. "Hello, Fox." "Hello, sir. What's up?" Dr. Curtis, Alain's divisional surgeon, dived out of the car into the shelter. "What the devil have you found, Alain?" "Garcia," said Alain. "Here," ejaculated Fox. "Dead?" asked Curtis. "Very. I think he's taken nitric acid." "Good God," said Curtis.
Bloody loathsome way of committing suicide. He didn't know it was nitric acid. Accident? No. Murder. It was almost dark when they got back to the yard. Alain went straight to his room, followed by Fox. He dropped into an armchair. Fox switched on the light. "You want a drink, sir?" he said with a look at Alain. "I've got my emergency flask here." "Poured most of mine down Macaulay's gullet," said Alain. "Very well, Fox, thank you. Have one yourself, and let's be little devils together. Now then, where do we stand? You were very silent in that place of horror. Do you agree with my theory?" "Yes, sir, I do. I've been turning it over in my mind, and I don't see how any other theory will fit all the facts, most especially the tuft of hair torn from the scalp and found, as you might say, for the greater part on the floor." Fox briefly sucked in his short moustache and wiped his hand across his mouth. "You must have jerked him out very considerably," he said, "and have been held on to very determinedly." "Very. And I cannot believe a man in Garcia's condition could have gone through all the game with the caravan and the transport. We don't even know if he could drive. Oh, Lord, I better go along and tell the AC about this afternoon. Then I'll write up my report, and I think this evening we'd better go broody on this case." Alain had a long interview with his assistant commissioner, then wrote up his report and took Fox off to dine at his flat. After dinner they settled down over the fire to a systematic review of the whole case. At 11 o'clock, Nigel Bathgate turned up. "Hello," said Alain. "Get yourself a drink. How did you hit it off with Bobby O'Dawn?" "Ah, ha, ha! Wouldn't you like to know?" "We are not in the mood," said Alain, "for comedy." "All right. As a matter of fact, I'm afraid from your point of view the visit was not a howling success. I took her out to lunch and gave her champagne, for which I expect the yard to reimburse me. She got fairly chatty, but nothing much to the purpose. She said Garcia found out Sonia had told her about the Pilgrim game. Garcia was absolutely livid and said he'd do Sonia in if she couldn't hold her tongue. It was at this stage, Alain, that Bobby took another pull at her champagne and then said, 'So you see, dear, I can't say anything about Friday night. If he knows she told me, as sure as God's above us, he'll do for me too.' And then, as there was no more champagne, the party broke up." "Well, I'll pay for the champagne," said Alain. "Damn this girl, Fox. She knows who had the date with Garcia on Friday night." The telephone rang. Alain picked up the receiver. "Hello, yes?" "You sure?" "I see, thank you." He put down the receiver and looked at Fox. The hole on the cuff of Pilgrim's coat was made by an acid, probably nitric acid. The inquest on the body of Sonia Gluck was held at Bossicott on the morning of Thursday, September 22nd. The court was jammed to the doors. Otherwise, the proceedings were as colourless as the coroner, a gentleman with an air of irritated incredulity, could make them. He dealt roundly with the witnesses and with the evidence, reducing everything by a sort of sleight of hand to a dead norm. Alain gave formal evidence on the finding of Garcia's body and asked for an adjournment. The whole thing was over by 11 o'clock. In the corridor, Alain caught Fox by the arm. "Come on, Brer Fox. We're for Boxover. I've got my mother's car. Looks less official." In a very few minutes they were travelling down a fortunately deserted road at 50 miles an hour. Fox cleared his throat. "What's that, Brer Fox?" asked Alain. "I didn't speak, Mr. Alain. Are we in a hurry?" "Not particularly. I have a disposition of speed come upon me." "I see," said Fox dryly. Trees and hedges flew past in a grey blur. From the back of the car a muffled voice suddenly chanted,
"I thought I saw Inspector Alain hunting for a clue. I looked again and saw it was an inmate at the zoo. Good God, I said, it's very hard to judge between these two."
Alain took his foot off the accelerator. Fox slewed round and stared into the back of the car. From an upheaval of rugs, Nigel's head emerged.
"I thought," he continued, "I saw Gargantua in fancy worsted socks. I looked again and saw it was a mammoth picking locks. Good God, I said, it might have been my friend Inspector Fox."
"Rude is never funny," said Alain. "When did you hide in my mother's car?"
"Immediately after the old gentleman pronounced the word adjournment. Where are we bound for?"
"I shan't tell you. Sit down behind there."
They arrived at Boxover and drew up outside a rather charming Georgian house on the outskirts of the village. 20 minutes, said Alain, looking from his watch to the speedometer. It's 2 miles from the studio to Bossicott. At night you could do the whole trip in a quarter of an hour or less. Now then, wait by the car until I give you a leery nod, both of you. He rang the front doorbell, and the door was opened by a manservant. Alain, with a grimace at them over his shoulder, stepped inside, leaving the door open. "Come on, Mr. Bathgate," said Fox. "That means us." They joined Alain in a little hall that was rather overwhelmed with the horns, masks, and hides of dead animals. "Mrs. Pascoe is away," whispered Alain, "but the gallant captain is within. Here he comes." Captain Pascoe was short, plump, and vague-looking. He had prominent light blue eyes and a red face. He smelt of whisky. "I'm sorry to bother you, Captain Pascoe," said Alain.
"That's all right. You from Scotland Yard, are you? This business over at Bossicott, what?"
"That's it. We're checking up everybody's movements on the night in question. You'll understand it has to be done."
"Oh, quite. Routine, what? Have a drink?"
Thank you so much, but I think we'll get on with the job." Alain led him through the weekend from the moment when Valmy Seacliff and Pilgrim arrived up to the time they all sat down to dinner. Now, I understand that during dinner Miss Seacliff complained of a headache.
No, not till after dinner. Minor point, but we may as well be accurate, Inspector."
"Certainly, sir. Stupid of me. Was it about the time you had coffee that she first spoke of it?"
"No. I remember Valmy made a face over her coffee, took a swig at it, and then did a sort of shudder, and my wife said, 'What's up?' or words to the same effect. Val said the coffee was bitter, and then Pilgrim looked a bit sheepish, and I said, 'Was yours bitter?' And he said, 'Matter of fact, it was. Funny, mine was all right.' Pilgrim persuaded her to have a glass of port after champagne, and she said at the time it would upset her. She's a lovely thing. Damn good rider to hounds. Lovely hounds. Goes as straight and well as the best of 'em. Look at that."
He fumbled in a drawer of his writing desk and produced a press photograph of Valmy Seacliff looking magnificent on a hunter. Captain Pascoe gloated over it, handed it to Alain, and flung himself back in his chair.
"Not till after dinner that she talked about feeling under the weather."
"And then," said Alain, "I believe you played bridge?"
"Yes, that's right. But by that time Val was looking very seedy and said her head was splitting, so after 2 or 3 hands we chucked it up and wife took Val up to her room."
"Gave her some aspirin, perhaps?"
"No. Pilgrim rushed off and got some aspirin for her. Anxious about her as an old hen. She took the bottle up with her. My wife tucked her up and went to her own room. Pilgrim and I had a whisky and soda and turned in. That was at 10:30. I wound up the clocks, and we went and had a look at Val. Naughty little thing hadn't taken her aspirin. Said it made her sick, trying to swallow. So Pilgrim dissolved 3 in water, and she promised she'd take 'em. My wife looked in later and found her sound asleep. We were all tucked up and snoozing by 11, I should think."
Alain asked to see the bedrooms. Captain Pascoe mixed himself another drink and escorted them over the house.
"Yeah, Val had this one, and that fellow was next door, what?"
He sat on the edge of Valmay's bed and finished his drink. He glared round the room, sucking his upper lip.
"Tchah!" he said suddenly. "Look at that. Disgraceful. Staff work in this house is abominable. Maids away."
He pointed unsteadily to the mantelpiece.
"Abominable. Never been touched. Look at this."
He turned his eye on the bedside table. A dirty table napkin lay on top of a row of books. Underneath it was a tumbler holding 3 fingers of murky fluid.
"That's been there since Friday night, I mean."
Alain slipped in front of him. "Maddening, that sort of thing. I wonder if we might see Mr. Pilgrim's room, sir."
"By George, we'll see every room in this house,"
shouted Captain Pascoe. Alain followed him, looked over his shoulder at Fox, raised his left eyebrow, and disappeared. To Nigel's surprise, Fox said, "Wait here, Mr. Bathgate, please," then darted out of the room and reappeared in about a minute. Fox, with surprising dexterity and speed, whipped a small, wide-necked bottle from his pocket, poured the contents of the tumbler into it, corked it, and wrapped the tumbler up in his handkerchief.
"Now, sir, if you'll take those down and put them in the chief's car, quickly does it."
When Nigel got back, he found that Captain Pascoe, accompanied by Alain and Fox, had returned to the hall and was yelling for his servant. The captain suddenly collapsed into an armchair, showed signs of drowsiness, and appeared to lose all interest in his visitors. Alain spoke to the servant. We are police officers and are making a few inquiries about the affair at Bossicott. Will you show us the garage, please? Very good, sir, said the man stolidly. He showed them a double garage about 200 yards down the lane. Captain Pascoe's Morris Cowley occupied less than half the floor space. Ah, yes, said Alain. I suppose now that Mr. Pilgrim's car fitted in very comfortably? Oh, yes, sir. Nice car, isn't it? Very nice job, sir. Tiger on petrol, sir. Really? What makes you think that? Well, sir, I asked the gentleman on Saturday morning was she all right for petrol, and he said yes, she was filled up as full as she'd go in Bossicott. Well, sir, I looked at the gauge, and she'd eaten up 2 gallons coming over here. 12 miles, sir, no more. I looked to see if she was leaking, but she wasn't. Thank you very much, said Alain. I think that's all. Thank you very much indeed, sir, said the man, closing his hand gratefully. Alain, Fox, and Nigel returned to their car and drove away. Get that tumbler, Fox? Asked Alain. Yes, sir, and the liquid. Are you going to have the stuff analysed? Yes, damn quick about it, too, if possible. And what then? Why then, said Alain, we'll be within sight of an arrest. The analyst's report on the contents of the tumbler came through at 9:30 that evening. The fluid contained a solution of Bayer's aspirin, approximately 3 tablets. The glass bore a clear imprint of Basil Pilgrim's fingers and thumb. When Alain had read the analyst's report, he rang up his assistant commissioner, had a long talk with him, and then sent for Fox. There's one thing we must make sure of, he said wearily, and that's the position of the light on the figure outside the studio window. Our game with the string wasn't good enough. We'll have to get something a bit more positive, Brer Fox. So, for the last time, Alain and Fox drove through the night to Tatler's End House. The Bossicott church clock struck midnight as Fox took up his old position outside the studio window. Alain walked down the lane and returned in a few minutes. Fox, he said, the ray of light that comes through the hole in the blind alights upon your bosom. I think we are on the right track. At 10 o'clock the next morning, 2 police cars drove up to Tatler's End House. Alain, Fox, and 2 plainclothesmen went up the steps to the front door. The butler showed them into Troy's library. I think, Fox, if you don't mind, said Alain. Certainly, sir. We'll wait in the hall. Troy came in. Good morning, said Alain, and his smile contradicted the formality of his words. I thought you might prefer to see us before we go any further. Yes. You are going to make an arrest, aren't you? I think we shall probably do so. I'm glad you decided to lunch with my mother. It will be easier for you to get right away from everything. I suggest that you drive over there now. Troy's chin went up. Thank you, she said. It's very kind of you to think of me, but however illogically, I would feel as if I was funking something if I went away before you did. I've got my students to think of. You must see that. I shan't make a nuisance of myself. You know perfectly well that ever since I met you, you have made a nuisance of yourself. You've made my job 100% more difficult because you have taken possession of my thoughts as well as my heart. And now you go off to your students and think that over. I want to speak to Pilgrim, if you please. Troy gazed bleakly at him. Then she bit her lips, and Alain saw that her eyes were full of tears. Oh, hell and damnation, he said. It's all right, I'm going. Shut up, mumbled Troy, and went. Fox came in and joined Alain at the fire. They waited in silence until Basil Pilgrim came in with one of the yardmen. The second man walked in after them and stood inside the door. Good morning, said Pilgrim. Good morning, Mr. Pilgrim. We would like to clear up 1 or 2 points relating to your former statement and to our subsequent investigations. Certainly. Alain consulted his notebook. What does your car do to the gallon? He asked. 16? Sure of that? Yes, she may do a bit more on long runs. Right. Now, if you please, we'll go back to Friday evening during your visit to Captain and Mrs. Pascoe. Can you tell us who poured out and who handed round the coffee? Do you mean about Val's coffee being bitter? Mine was bitter too, beastly. You both took black coffee? Yes. And sugar? And sugar. Who put the sugar in the coffee? Good Lord, I don't know. I believe I did. You didn't say anything about your coffee being bitter. I didn't like to. I gave Val a look and made a face, and she nodded. She said, "Sybil, darling, your coffee is perfectly frightful." Val is always terribly direct. Later on, when Miss Seacliff complained of feeling unwell, you gave her some aspirin, didn't you? Yes. Was the bottle of aspirins in your pocket? I went upstairs and got it out of my suitcase. When did you actually give Miss Seacliff the aspirins? When she went to bed. Did she take them? Not then. We looked in after she was in bed, and she said she could never swallow aspirins, and so I dissolved 3 in water and left the tumbler by her bedside. Did you see her drink this solution? No, Where's the bottle? I suppose it's in my room upstairs. After you left Miss Seacliff's room on Friday night, where did you go? I had a drink with Pascoe and went to bed. You slept straight through the night? Like the dead, said Pilgrim. I suppose I had a bit too much of Pascoe's 1875 Courvoisier. I see. Now, Mr. Pilgrim, I want you to look at this, if you please. He nodded to one of his men, who came forward with a brown paper parcel. He opened it, and took out a most disreputable garment. Why, said Pilgrim, that's my old car coat. Yes, I want you to tell me when you burnt this little hole in the cuff there, do you see? How the devil shall I know? I've had that thing for donkey's years. It's obviously a cigarette burn. It's an acid burn. Acid? Might it be nitric acid? Why? Do you do any etching, Mr. Pilgrim? Yes, but not in my garage coat. Look here, Mr. Alleyne. Will you feel in the pockets? Pilgrim thrust a hand into one of the pockets and pulled out a pair of gloves. If you look at the back of the right-hand glove, said Alleyne, you will see among all the greasy stains and worn patches another very small mark. Look at it, please. There. It is exceedingly small, but it, too, was made by an acid. Can you account for it? Quite frankly, I can't. I see. Have you ever lent this coat to anyone else? Has anyone else ever worn the gloves? I don't know, they may have. He looked up quickly, and his eyes were suddenly bright with terror. I think it's quite likely I've lent it, he said, or a garage hand might have put it on sometime, easily. It may be acid from a battery. Have you ever lent it to Miss Seacliff, for instance? Never. It's an old riding Burberry, isn't it? Yes. You didn't lend it to her to hack in at your father's house, Ankerton, during the weekend? Good Lord, no. Valmay has got very smart riding clothes of her own. Not even the gloves? Pilgrim achieved a laugh. Those gloves? I'd just given Valmay 6 pairs of coloured gloves, which she tells me are fashionable. She was so thrilled she even lunched in purple gloves and dined in scarlet ones. I mean to ride in. She had her own hunting gloves. What is all this? She goes well to hounds, doesn't she? Straight as the best. Yes. What sort of horse did you mount her on? A hunter, one of mine. Clubbed mane and tail? Yes. Look inside the right-hand glove at the base of the little finger. Do you see that bloodstain? I see a small stain. It's been analysed. It is a bloodstain. Do you remember recently cutting or scratching the base of your little finger? Yes, I think I do. How did it happen? I forget. I think it was at Ankerton, on a bramble or something. And you had these gloves with you at the time? I suppose so, yes. I thought you said the gloves and coat always lived in the car. It is rather absurd to go on with this, Pilgrim said. I'm afraid I must refuse to answer any more questions. You're perfectly within your rights. Fox, ask Miss Seacliff if she will be good enough to come in. Thank you, Mr. Pilgrim. Will you wait outside? No, said Pilgrim. I'm going to hear what you say to her. Alleyne hesitated. Very well, he said at last. He dropped the coat and gloves behind the desk. Valmay Seacliff arrived in her black slacks and magenta pullover. She made, as usual, a good entrance, shutting the door behind her and leaning against it for a moment to survey the men. Hello, she said. More investigations? What's the matter with you, Basil? You look as if you'd murdered somebody. Pilgrim didn't answer. Alleyne said, I have sent for you, Miss Seacliff, to know if you can help us. But I should adore to help you, Mr. Alleyne. Did you drink the solution of aspirin that Mr. Pilgrim prepared for you on Friday night? Not all of it. It was too bitter. But you said before that you drank it. Well, I did have a sip. I slept all right without it. How is your cut hand? Oh, it's quite recovered. May I see it, please? She held it out with the same gesture that she had used on Monday night, but this time the fingers trembled. Below the base of the little finger there was still a very thin reddish scar. "You told me that you cut your hand on your horse's mane," said Alain.
"No, you told me that, Mr. Alain."
"You accepted the explanation."
"Did I?"
"How do you say now that you cut your hand?"
"I did it on the reins."
"Mr. Pilgrim, did you see this cut on Saturday evening? It must have been quite sore then, sharp, thin cut."
"I didn't see her hand. She wore gloves."
"All through dinner?"
"Scarlet gloves. They looked lovely," she said. "Didn't they, Basil?"
"Do you remember that on Monday night you told me you had no pretensions to being a good horsewoman?"
"Modesty, Mr. Alain."
Alain turned aside. He moved behind the desk, stooped, and in a second the old raincoat and the gloves were lying on the top of the desk. "Have you ever seen those before?" asked Alain.
"It's Basil's, isn't it?"
"Come and look at it." She walked slowly across to the desk and looked at the coat and gloves. Alain picked up the sleeve and without speaking pointed a long forefinger to the acid hole in the cuff. He lifted the collar and turned it back and pointed to a whitish stain. He dropped the coat, took up the left-hand glove and turned it inside out. He pointed to a small stain under the base of the little finger. And still he did not speak. It was Basil Pilgrim who broke the silence. "I don't know what he's driving at, Val, but you've never worn the things. I know you haven't. I told him so. I'll swear it. I'll swear you've never worn them. I know you haven't." "You bloody fool!" she screamed. "You bloody fool!" "Valmay Seacliff," began Alain, "I arrest you for the murder of Wolf Garcia." Troy sat on a rug in the central grass plot of Lady Alain's rose garden. Alain stood and looked down at her. "You see," he said, "it was a very clumsy, messy and ill-planned murder. It seemed the most awful muddle, but it boils down to a fairly simple narrative. We hadn't much doubt after Monday night that Garcia had set the trap for Sonia. He left his prints on the opium jar, and as Malmsey had prepared the first pipe, Garcia evidently gave himself another. He must have been in a state of partial recovery with a sort of exalted carryover when he got the idea of jamming the knife through the floor of the throne. Motive? Sonia had been badgering him to marry her. She was going to have his child and wouldn't let him alone. She came between him and his work. She probably threatened to sue him for maintenance to make a full-sized scandal. The opium suggested a beautifully simple and macabre way out of it all. I saw Sonia's friend in the chorus, Miss O'Dorn, again this morning after the arrest. I got a rather fuller account of the blackmailing game. Sonia and Garcia were both in it. Sonia had tackled Pilgrim and threatened to tell the Methodist peer that Basil was the father of her child. He wasn't, but that made no odds. Basil stumped up and Sonia handed the cash to Garcia. We found a note from Garcia to Valmay Seacliff in which he coolly said he'd bought painting materials at her shop and put them down to her. The wording of the letter suggested that he had some sort of upper hand over her, and when I first saw Bobby O'Dorn, she obviously had information up her sleeve and admitted as much. She told Bathgate that Sonia had said Garcia would kill both of them if they babbled. When Sonia died, Bobby O'Dorn was certain Garcia had done it, and that she'd be the next victim if she didn't keep quiet. Now he's dead, and we've got Valmay Seacliff. Miss O'Dorn is all for a bit of front-page publicity, and told me this morning that Sonia had kept her au fait with the whole story. Garcia blackmailed Valmay Seacliff. He said he'd tell Basil Pilgrim that she'd been his, Garcia's, mistress. He said he'd go to the Methodist pier with a story of studio parties that would throw the old boy into a righteous fury and completely cook Seacliff's goose. Garcia worked the whole thing out with Sonia. She was to tackle Pilgrim while he went for Valmay Seacliff. Garcia had started to work with Seacliff, who at first wouldn't rise. But he'd done some drawings of Seacliff in the nude, which he said he'd send to old Pilgrim with a suitable letter, and he told her that Sonia was also prepared to do her bit of blackmail as well. At last, Valmay Seacliff, terrified of losing Pilgrim, said she'd meet Garcia on Friday night in the studio when they were all safely away and discuss payment. All this Garcia told Sonia, and Sonia told Bobby O'Dorn, swearing her to secrecy. O'Dorn was too frightened of Garcia to tell me the Seacliff side, and I also think she honestly felt she couldn't break her word. She's got a sort of code, that funny, hard little baggage, and she's stuck to it. But, of course, without her evidence, we'd got no motive as far as Seacliff was concerned.
When did you suspect Valmey?
I wasn't very certain until I saw that the person who murdered Garcia had held his head back by the hair and that he had struggled so hard that he had struggled. I then remembered the cut on Seacliff's hand, and how she had shown it to me only when she saw me looking at it, and how she had said it had been made by her horse's reins when it had obviously been made by something much finer. But to go back a bit, from the moment we learnt that it was Seacliff who posed the model, I felt that we must watch her pretty closely.
I don't understand that. You say Garcia set the trap with the knife?
Yes, but I believe Seacliff watched him through a hole in the studio window blind.
Seacliff?
Yes. She had put 3 aspirins in Pilgrim's coffee to ensure his sleeping soundly. When she realized he had noticed the coffee tasted odd, he made a face at her, she quickly raised an outcry about her own. She pretended to have a headache in order to get them all to bed early. She slipped out to the garage, wearing slacks and a sweater, put on Pilgrim's old coat and gloves, and drove back to the studio, getting there about midnight, with the intention of arguing about blackmail with Garcia. This was the meeting Miss Phillida Lee overheard Sonia discussing with Garcia. Sonia told Miss Bobby O'Dorn all about it, and Miss O'Dorn told me this morning. But you should remember that until this morning Miss O'Dorn had only elaborated what we already knew, the Pilgrim-Sonia side. However, I give you the whole thing as completely as I can. Valmey Seacliff arrived at the studio in a desperate attempt to placate Garcia. She must have left the car somewhere in the lane and walked down, meaning to come in at the side gate. Your maid Ethel and her boy, returning from the flicks, saw the figure of a shortish man standing outside the studio window, apparently looking through the hole in the blind. He wore a mackintosh with the collar turned up. The ray of light caught his beret, which was pulled down on one side, hiding his face. Both Garcia and Pilgrim were too tall for the light to get them anywhere above the chest. So was Malmsley. Seacliff seemed to be the only one about the right height. When we saw Pilgrim's old coat in his car, we noticed whitish marks on the collar that suggested face or neck powder, and they smelt of Seacliff. It was so dirty it didn't seem likely she would let him embrace her while he was wearing it. When we looked inside the left-hand glove, we noticed a bloodstain that corresponded with the cut on her hand. That, of course, came into the picture after the Garcia affair. I believe that she actually watched Garcia set his trap for Sonia, and decided to say nothing about it. I believe she went in, probably got him to drink a good deal more whiskey, and offered to drive him up to London. You told me he did a little etching.
Yes, he prepared a plate a few days before he went.
Then perhaps he said he'd take the acid to bite it. Is that the right word? Anyway, she got out your caravan, backed it up to the window, and there's a slope down from the garage, enough to freewheel into the lane and start on compression. The servants wouldn't think anything odd if they heard a car in the lane. Malmsley had helped Garcia get everything ready. All she had to do was open the window, wheel the clay model over the sill into the caravan, get Garcia aboard, and start off. The packing case had already been addressed by Garcia, so she knew the address, even if he was incapable of directing her. I think myself that he had told her exactly where the warehouse was when he asked her to go there to see him, and she has admitted that he gave her a sketch map. Probably his idea was she should pay blackmail to him while he was there. She made another rather interesting slip over that. She told me that as soon as she heard the word Holloway, she remembered that Garcia had said his warehouse was near the prison, and she had told him to be careful he didn't get locked up. Holloway is a woman's prison. Her very feeble joke would have been a little less feeble if he was blackmailing her, and the place of assignation was not Holloway, but Brixton. By giving us Holloway as the district, she was sending us off in exactly the opposite direction to the right one. We might have hunted round Holloway for weeks. I wondered if she had been the victim of a sort of word association, and I decided to go for Brixton. Luckily enough, as it turned out. As a matter of fact, she had twice fallen into the trap of substituting for truth something that is linked with it in her mind. The first time was over the cut on her hand. It had been made when she was standing above Garcia with her hand wound in his hair. She saw me looking at the scar, decided to speak of it before I did, was perhaps reminded subconsciously of horse's hair, a mane gripped in the hand, rejected the idea of hair altogether and substituted reins. Have you had enough of this, Troy? No, I want to know all about it. There's not much more. She drove Garcia to his warehouse. He'd got the keys. She murdered him there because she was hell-bent on marrying Pilgrim and becoming a very rich peeress, and because it was in Garcia's power to stop her. She's an egomaniac. She drove the caravan back to your garage and drove herself back to the Pascoe's house in Pilgrim's car. The distance to the warehouse is 30 miles. At that time of night she'd do it easily in an hour and a half. She must have been back at the studio by 3 and probably got to the Pascoe's by past. Even supposing she lost her way, and I don't think she would, because there's a good map in the caravan, she'd a margin of 2 hours before there was a chance of the servants being about. And I'm finishing up where I began. She murdered Sonia, knowing the knife was there, as deliberately as she murdered Garcia. Will they find her guilty? I don't know, Troy. Her behavior when we arrested her was pretty damning. She turned on Pilgrim like a wildcat because he kept saying he'd swear she'd never worn the coat. If he'd said she had often worn it, half our case would have gone up in smoke. Alain was silent for a moment and then knelt down on the rug beside Troy. Has this all made a great difference to you? He said. Is it going to take you a long time to put it behind you? I don't know. It's been a bit of a shock for all of us. For Pilgrim, yes. The others will be dining out on it in no time. Not you. I think I'm sort of stunned. It's not that I liked any of them much. It's just the feeling of all the vindictiveness in the house. So disquieting to remember what Seacliffe's thoughts must have been during the last week. I almost feel I ought to have a priest in with a bell and a book to purify the house. And now, the thought of the trial is unspeakably shocking. I don't know where I am. She turned helplessly towards Alain, and in a moment she was in his arms. No, no, said Troy. You mustn't think. I know. Alain held her strongly. He could feel her heart beating secretly against his own. Everything about him, the trees, the ground beneath him, and the clouds in the still autumn sky rose like bright images in his mind and vanished in a wave of exultation. He was alone in the world with her, and with that moment of supremacy before him came the full assurance that he must not take it. He knew quite certainly that he must let his moment go by. Shall I tell you what I think? I think that if we had met again in a different way, you might have loved me. But because of all that has happened, your thoughts of me are spoiled. There's an association of cold and rather horrible officiousness. Well, perhaps it's not quite as bad as all that, but my job has come between us. You know, at first I thought you disliked me very much. You were so prickly. Then I began to hope a little. Don't cry, dear Troy. It's a great moment for me, this. Don't think I misunderstand. You so nearly love me, don't you? So nearly. Then I shall still allow myself to hope a little.
This has been an Hachette Digital production of Artists in Crime, written by Nio Marsh and read by Benedict Cumberbatch. Abridged by Katie Nichol. Produced and directed by Tamsin Collison. Text copyright
Nio Marsh, 1938. Production copyright, Hachette Digital, 2008.
Audible hopes you have enjoyed this program.